Somewhere beneath the shining towers of the most famous city planet in the galaxy, in tunnels that have never once felt sunlight, there is a species of scavenger that has been evolving in total darkness for tens of thousands of years, and almost nobody who lives in the light above has ever heard of it. Before we get into any of that, if you're the kind of person who likes falling asleep to hours of dense lore with a calm voice walking you through it, go ahead and subscribe now, because this channel is basically built for exactly that kind of long, slow, background noise deep dive, and there's a lot more where this came from. So let's actually talk about where all of this starts. Because the story of organized crime in the Star Wars galaxy does not start with Jabba, and it does not start with the Empire, and it does not even start with the Republic. It starts tens of thousands of years earlier, in the dark, underneath a planet that would eventually become the capital of everything. Coruscant, in its earliest days, was just a planet. It had weather, it had dirt, it had a horizon you could actually see. That version of Coruscant is almost impossible to picture now, because by the time most stories in this galaxy take place, the entire surface has been paved over so many times that nobody alive remembers what the original ground even looked like. But there was a beginning, and it happened roughly 100,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, which is the reference point most galactic historians use to measure time, kind of like how our own calendars orbit around one particular year in one particular way. At that point, the earliest layers of what would eventually become an entire planet-spanning city were already going up. There's a specific term for a planet that is completely urbanized from pole to pole with no natural land left exposed anywhere, and Coruscant was on a very long path toward becoming the textbook example of one. Construction did not stop. It could not stop. Each generation built on top of what the last generation had already built, and within a few thousand years. The earliest 50 levels of the city had been buried so deeply that they would never again see open sky. By around 95,000 years before Yavin, those bottom levels experienced their final sunset, so to speak. After that point, they were sealed beneath layer after layer of duracrete and steel, and permanent artificial lighting became the only kind of lighting anyone down there would ever know again. This had consequences for anything that used to live on the surface. Coruscant, like most planets, had its own native wildlife before the city swallowed it whole. Most of that wildlife did not survive the transition. As best as anyone can piece together from surviving records, only 2 non-sentient native species made it through relatively intact. One adapted right alongside the growing city and basically evolved with it. The other didn't really change much at all. It just found a way to keep surviving in the gaps the construction left behind. Around this same era, a species known for exploring and cataloging distant worlds paid Coruscant a visit, and their reaction is worth mentioning because it's almost funny in hindsight. They looked at what was, even then, one of the most ambitious engineering projects in galactic history, and they were completely unimpressed. To them, a planet being buried under its own architecture wasn't a marvel of civilization. It looked crude. It looked like a species that hadn't figured out how to build anything elegant yet, just something big. But down in the sealed-off levels, something else was happening that had nothing to do with what anyone above thought about the architecture. Life did not simply stop once sunlight stopped reaching those levels. It adapted into something stranger. New creatures emerged that had never existed anywhere else in the galaxy, shaped entirely by permanent darkness, toxic air, and generations of isolation. One of the strangest results of this process was a group of humanoids who, over unimaginable stretches of time spent completely without natural light, devolved into something closer to shambling, half-aware husks of what their ancestors had once been. Another creature that emerged down there had lost its eyes completely, hunting instead by sound and scent. Because in a world with no light at all, eyes are just wasted evolutionary investment. And it wasn't only the sentient adjacent life that changed. The vermin down there grew to sizes that would be almost unbelievable anywhere else in the galaxy. Enormous slug-like creatures crawled through the deepest tunnels. Worm-like predators stretched to lengths you'd associate with starships rather than animals, and were known to prey on anyone unfortunate enough to wander too close. Armored rodents nested in structural gaps. Insectoid scavengers swarmed through the endless piles of discarded material that thousands of years of habitation had left behind. And scattered among all of this were feral descendants of creatures that had escaped captivity generations before, now running wild through corridors that no living person had mapped in centuries. By the time the Galactic Republic was founded, somewhere in the neighborhood of 25,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, this underworld was already unfathomably old. It had been developing in isolation for over 70,000 years before the first government official on Coruscant ever took an oath of office. And here's the detail that really defines everything that follows for the next several dozen millennia. The newly formed Republic did essentially nothing about it. The underlevels kept functioning exactly as they always had. The new government, for all its lofty ideals about unifying a galaxy, simply looked past what was happening a few kilometers beneath its own feet. The criminal culture down there predated organized civilization on Coruscant by tens of thousands of years, and no amount of Senate proceedings was ever going to undo something that ancient. To give you a sense of the sheer vertical scale we're talking about here, Coruscant's habitable levels stretched from a single ground zero point all the way up past level 5,000. Anywhere near the very bottom of that scale was considered flatly uninhabitable, even by the standards of people who were used to living in genuinely brutal conditions. Most of what people mean when they talk about the Coruscant underworld sits more than a kilometer below the elevated platforms where the wealthy actually live their daily lives, walking around in filtered air and never once looking down. The only real connections between these two worlds, the shining upper city and the buried lower one, were massive ventilation shafts, structures that doubled as both air circulation systems and the rare passageways between levels. Sunlight obviously never made it down through them. What did make it down was heat, noise, and thousands of years of accumulated industrial waste, which meant the air at the bottom was thick with toxins that most species would find genuinely dangerous to breathe for extended periods. Meanwhile, the people living comfortably at the top enjoyed clean, filtered air pumped in through massive systems, most of them never spending a single conscious thought on where the filtered-out contaminants actually ended up. The worst pockets of the underworld earned their own reputations over the centuries. Certain districts became so thoroughly associated with organized crime that even other criminals treated them with caution. One particular level, positioned exactly 1,313 levels above the planet's actual core, became a magnet for bounty hunters, smugglers, and every flavor of galactic criminal you could imagine. Down there, the strong preyed on the weak, without any real fear of consequence. The official security forces tasked with patrolling these areas existed more as a formality than an actual deterrent. They were so vastly outnumbered that their presence barely registered as a threat to anyone actually running the streets. Entire crime families effectively governed these districts instead, using narrow alleys and abandoned megastructures as bases from which to run operations that stretched across multiple levels. And here's one of the genuinely strange facts buried in all of this history. Nobody in the modern galaxy actually knows where Coruscant's original surface is anymore. The literal ground level of the planet has been lost to history. Buried under so many successive layers of construction, each stacked on top of the last, that the concept of original Coruscant is basically a historical abstraction at this point. The only physical trace of that original surface that anyone can still point to are the highest peaks of a mountain range that happens to poke up just far enough to break through the artificial crust that now covers the entire world. There's a piece of oral history, more folklore than fact at this point, about a single tavern somewhere deep in those buried levels that supposedly hasn't seen actual sunlight in 90,000 years. And the wild part is that down there, that fact isn't treated as remarkable at all. It's just background information, the kind of thing regulars might mention in passing the same way you'd mention which way the wind is blowing. The underworld of Coruscant predates the Republic by tens of thousands of years, and it would go on to outlast the Empire that eventually replaced that Republic as well. Every government that has ever claimed to rule this planet has, in effect, simply been the latest layer built on top of something far older, far darker, and far more permanent than any Senate or Emperor ever managed to be. It is, in a very real sense, the true foundation the entire galactic underworld would eventually be built on top of. But if Coruscant's underworld is the oldest continuous criminal ecosystem in galactic history, the first person to actually build something resembling an empire out of pure ambition and conquest predates the Republic itself by a good margin, and his story is one of the stranger footnotes in galactic history, because almost nobody talks about him anymore, despite the fact that he once controlled thousands of worlds. Roughly 50 years before the Republic was even a concept anyone had put into writing, a warlord known to history as Zim the Despot controlled an empire spanning thousands of worlds, and almost nobody outside of a handful of dedicated history enthusiasts remembers his name today. Zim was born a human male on a planet called Vyurg, out in a region known as the Cronies Sweeps. His father, remembered across that sector as the Pirate King, had spent an entire lifetime carving out his own personal domain in a territory called the Kingdom of Kron. When leadership eventually passed down to his son, somewhere around 25,130 years before the Battle of Yavin, Zim inherited a modest starting position by galactic standards, one home planet plus roughly a dozen additional worlds under his family's control. That was his opening hand, and by any reasonable measure, it was already more territory than most rulers in galactic history ever managed to claim. Zim wasn't interested in staying modest. By the time he was barely 20 years old, he was already pushing outward through open warfare, and the first decade of his rule earned its own specific name in galactic history books, the Expansionist Period. During that single stretch of years, Zim conquered the bulk of an entire cluster of star systems. One of his biggest prizes was a regional power containing a world called Devaron. Once he had that world firmly under his control, Zim did something that tells you a great deal about how he saw himself. He adopted an ancient title, one borrowed from a long-vanished civilization known as the Rakata, a species that had once ruled an empire so vast it dominated the galaxy tens of thousands of years before Zim was even born. By claiming that title for himself, Zim was making a very specific statement to everyone watching. He did not see himself as merely another warlord carving out territory. He saw himself as the rightful heir to one of the most ancient empires the galaxy had ever produced. At the absolute height of his power, Zim's territory stretched across a truly staggering swath of the galaxy, spanning thousands of individual worlds under a single ruler. This was a sprawling military regime built entirely on the back of conquest, and the technology backing it up was unlike anything else operating in the galaxy at that point in history. His soldiers carried advanced energy weapons. They wore armor forged from an early superconducting alloy that gave his forces a serious edge in any direct confrontation. Most notably of all, Zim's armies fought alongside massive humanoid war droids, bipedal machines significantly larger than any standard soldier, built in part from scavenged technology his people had recovered from the wreckage of an older, fallen civilization. That inherited technology gave these war droids a level of independent decision-making that no other droid design of that era could match. Zim is generally credited as the very first ruler in galactic history to deploy centralized droid armies at this kind of scale. He didn't just use the concept, he essentially invented it. His navy was every bit as intimidating as his ground forces. His personal flagships carried names that struck fear into anyone who heard them across that stretch of space. And his fleets moved in coordinated formations built from several distinct classes of warship, each one loaded with serious firepower, torpedoes, concussion missiles, and a particularly nasty weapon that fired bursts of radiation capable of melting through enemy hull plating and frying the electronics inside. Zim's own ships were armored in that same superconducting alloy his infantry wore, which gave his vessels a distinctive mirrored hull capable of reflecting a significant portion of incoming energy weapon fire straight back at whoever fired it. But the single most feared part of Zim's entire regime wasn't his fleet, and it wasn't his war droids. It was his secret police, a covert organization of bounty hunters created specifically to remove Zim's most dangerous rivals without ever announcing themselves publicly. They didn't march in parades. They didn't make demands in the open. They worked quietly, manipulating galactic political outcomes from the shadows while Zim's actual armies handled the more visible fighting. This organization would go on to influence galactic events for thousands of years after Zim himself had faded from history entirely. But in the beginning, it was purely his personal instrument of control. Zim also kept his own subjects in line through outright fear. Rumors persisted for generations that he would eject entire groups of troublemakers into open space, rather than deal with unrest through any formal justice system. Whether every one of those specific stories was literally true or exaggerated over time barely mattered. The effect on the people living under his rule was identical either way. Total, pervasive fear of ever stepping out of line. His empire grew extraordinarily wealthy as it expanded, with an economy almost entirely oriented around sustaining continuous warfare. Shipyards and manufacturing centers across multiple worlds worked constantly to keep his war machines supplied, while other territories under his control built merchant vessels and navigational infrastructure that connected huge stretches of previously unexplored space into safe, reliable trade routes. Zim's empire could move goods, fuel, and soldiers across enormous distances without serious interruption, and the artisans of his home region actually competed with each other for the honor of winning his personal approval. He commissioned massive palaces on multiple worlds, and maintained a private royal retreat where one of the more legendary features of his entire reign existed, a set of gardens so exclusive that simply looking at them without permission carried the harshest possible punishment available under his rule, depending on which version of the story you believe. The gardeners maintaining this space were either slaves who had been blind since birth, specifically chosen so they could never actually see what they were tending, or disgraced military officers and conquered enemies sent there to serve out a final, humiliating punishment. Either way, the underlying message was consistent. In Zim's empire, beauty came with an extraordinarily steep price attached. Zim also sent waves of colonists out to uninhabited and depopulated worlds throughout his reign, part of a deliberate strategy to spread his cultural influence outward across as much territory as possible. He even commissioned an orbital fortress during this period, one that survives in galactic records under a different name today. Positioned specifically to keep a careful watch on a neighboring civilization he had started to take a serious interest in. That civilization was the Hutts. Beyond the outer edge of Zim's territory, in a region his forces had only recently begun exploring, his people encountered traders working on behalf of a much older, and at the time far less understood, slug-like civilization. Zim explored these border regions personally, and according to legend, ranged even further out to visit a distant, revered oracle during his travels. Through both his personal exploration and the quiet information-gathering work of his secret police, Zim slowly assembled a complete picture of exactly what the Hutts had, what they controlled, and what a full-scale confrontation between two major galactic powers might actually look like. Zim's reign was significant enough that an entire body of dramatic literature eventually grew up around his life. A single prolific playwright wrote dozens of plays chronicling his rule, all of which were eventually compiled into one sprawling collaborative literary work that historians still reference today. That's the scale of the impression Zim left on galactic culture, an entire theatrical canon built around one warlord's life and reign. And the confrontation his people had been quietly preparing for, the one against the Hutts, was about to become one of the most consequential wars in the early history of galactic crime. What followed was a conflict so massive that it eventually drew in something close to a quarter of every sentient species and intelligent machine in the entire galaxy. The two powers had already been competing over a contested region for several years by the time things came to a head, with everything ultimately centering on a single world both sides desperately wanted to control. On the Hutt side, leadership fell to a particularly cunning warlord who had declared himself ruler of the various Hutt clans. At first, Zim didn't actually believe war with the Hutts was inevitable. He thought there might be room to settle the dispute short of a full-scale conflict. But the Hutts made a catastrophic miscalculation. They suggested, apparently in complete seriousness, that Zim and his entire people should serve them as favored slaves, essentially demanding that the ruler of a 1,000-world empire bow down to them. That single suggestion was, unsurprisingly, the worst thing they could possibly have said to a man like Zim. He began preparing for all-out war almost immediately. The opening offensive came a little over a decade before that famous final confrontation, when Zim's forces devastated a lush Hutt colony world in an assault so brutal that Hutt oral history would remember it for millennia afterward as one of the single worst atrocities in their entire recorded history. But the war didn't stay one-sided for long. Zim's next major offensive, aimed at a different Hutt world, failed completely, and his forces were pushed back through a nebula region that we now know by a very different, very familiar name today. The same treacherous stretch of space that would eventually become famous for its spice mines, and one particular legendary smuggling route. Back then, it was simply known as a graveyard of black holes, and Zim lost a significant portion of his fleet trying to navigate through it. The Hutts realized after that exchange that they had badly underestimated their opponent. Their response was swift and serious. An entire fleet of Zim's forces was wiped out in a subsequent engagement, forcing Zim to withdraw from all the Hutt-claimed territory his people had taken. But characteristically, Zim refused to accept that withdrawal as an actual defeat. He treated it as nothing more than a temporary setback on the road to eventual total victory. He rebuilt his forces immediately, so confident in his eventual triumph that he had already renamed the targeted Hutt homeworld in his own private planning documents and drawn up detailed administrative plans for dividing Hutt territory into new provinces under his rule. He sent freshly built warships back into contested space to raid several more Hutt-aligned worlds. A year later, Zim made a move that no outsider had ever attempted in the entirety of recorded Hutt history. He formally demanded a second ritual battle at the contested world both sides wanted, invoking an ancient combat tradition the Hutts had always reserved strictly for settling disputes among their own clans. No outsider had ever dared invoke it before. The Hutt warlord was caught off guard by the sheer audacity of the challenge, but adapted quickly. His forces devastated the very best of Zim's elite biological troops in that second engagement, an elite formation that represented the finest soldiers his empire had produced. The battle ended in a massive grinding confrontation with no clear winner on either side, and it was significant enough that a poet from that era later composed an entire epic commemorating it. After that inconclusive second engagement, the Hutts arrived at an important realization. They simply could not win a straightforward, conventional war against Zim's forces. So they turned to something they would go on to become legendary for over the following 25,000 years: subterfuge. This is the moment when the underworld tactics that would eventually define Hutt criminal strategy for millennia truly began to take shape. They started paying privateers from a wide variety of species to harass Zim's border territories through hit and run raids, disrupting supply convoys and trade routes across his empire. Those privateer attacks cut deeply into Zim's shipping capacity over the following year and steadily drained his stockpiles of war materials, which in turn made him increasingly paranoid, forcing him to reroute his logistics through secret, heavily fortified bases. And this is where the Hutts reshaped the galactic underworld permanently through a single political maneuver. They imposed a binding treaty on 4 separate conquered species, locking all of them into permanent servitude as Hutt mercenaries. The truly remarkable part of this treaty is just how long it actually lasted. It remained in effect for millennia, all the way into an era thousands of years later that most people would recognize as a completely different galactic government entirely. The Hutts had, in effect, created a permanent mercenary army out of 4 entire civilizations with the stroke of a single agreement. A little over a decade after that renamed Second Engagement, the Hutt warlord issued one final challenge, a third and final battle at the same contested world, and Zim, unable to refuse a formal duel of honor without permanently losing face in front of his entire empire, accepted. What followed was almost beyond belief. The third battle lasted the equivalent of roughly 2.5 standard years of continuous, uninterrupted combat. A chronicler from that era who documented the entire engagement later recorded that no conflict in known history had any real equal to it in terms of sheer devastation and individual acts of heroism. As reinforcements kept arriving on both sides throughout the engagement, the total number of combatants eventually climbed to nearly a quarter of every sentient species and automaton in the entire galaxy. Very few battles in galactic history would ever come close to matching it purely in terms of scale. The Hutt forces at this final battle were bolstered significantly by the mercenary armies bound to them under that new treaty, soldiers who had been fed a steady diet of narcotics to keep them fighting through wave after wave of brutal engagements. These were the troops who ultimately found a way to crack Zim's most legendary weapon. The enslaved mercenaries lured his supposedly invincible war droids down into underground tunnels beneath the battlefield, and once the machines were trapped underground, methodically dismantled them one by one, even as they themselves fell in the process. While Zim's fleet was engaged in orbit, the ground forces finished off the bulk of his war droids below, then turned their attention to bombing his orbital platforms from underneath. His fleet was ultimately destroyed in orbit, with only a handful of ships managing to escape carrying whatever war droids they could salvage. On the ground, his already supply-starved armies, worn down by months of privateer harassment, were defeated completely. Here is where the official history and the more likely truth diverge sharply. The Hutt version of events simply says Zim fell during the battle. The more grounded account suggests something considerably darker. Zim was captured alive, paraded publicly across Hutt space as a trophy, and ultimately blinded before living out the rest of his life as a slave in the dungeons of the Hutt homeworld. Zim's own people, naturally, told a very different version of events, insisting he had been betrayed and ended through treachery rather than defeated outright, and that his treasure ship had escaped with a significant portion of his surviving war droids aboard, eventually depositing them on a distant world to guard something that would come to be known simply as the treasure vaults of Zim Thay. Despot. According to legend, those droids were maintained for generations afterward by a cult descended from the original crew of that escaping ship. There is one more piece of this conflict's legacy that still echoes through galactic culture. The world Zim had sacked at the very outset of the war was renamed in honor of the Hutt who had defended it, and from that point forward. A sacred Hutt holiday was celebrated annually to commemorate the night before that decisive final battle, when the Hutt defender had addressed his kin, his retainers, and his slaves before the fighting began. The Hutt victory in this final confrontation ended Zim's reign completely, opened the door to full Hutt domination of the outer regions of the galaxy, and kicked off nearly 2 centuries of essentially unchecked Hutt power, the true foundation upon which the entire modern galactic underworld would eventually be built. For 2 full centuries after Zim's defeat, the Hutts were, without any real competition, the single most powerful governing force anywhere in the galaxy. Then their entire civilization was struck by a catastrophe that reshaped everything, and what eventually rose from the wreckage would prove far more dangerous than any open empire could ever have been. The Hutt Empire had come together sometime shortly after 25,200 years before the Battle of Yavin, and for roughly 2 centuries afterward, no other government in the galaxy could match its reach. The Hutts dominated the outer regions of known space, controlling territory that stretched far beyond anything that would later become recognized republic borders, and they ran their civilization in a way genuinely different from anything anyone else had really attempted before. They could absolutely be ruthless warriors when the situation called for it, as Zim's fall had already proven beyond doubt, but warfare was never really what defined them at their core. Their influence was overwhelmingly economic. They consistently valued control over commerce far above territorial conquest for its own sake. What they wanted was ownership of trade, ownership of markets, ownership of supply lines. And they were entirely willing to deploy force whenever protecting those interests required it. None of this made them gentle rulers, of course. Any species the Hutts considered useful to their operations tended to be enslaved outright, and species they didn't find useful had an unfortunate tendency to simply vanish from galactic records entirely. Ancient records from various rimworlds document what happened to civilizations that got caught between feuding Hutt clans, or that had the misfortune of offending the wrong Hutt warlord at the wrong time. Entire populations were erased. One species, notably, managed to avoid both of those fates by winning genuine Hutt respect and negotiating ongoing independence in exchange for regular tribute. A rare exception that proved just how uncompromising the general rule actually was. The Hutts originally hailed from a single homeworld, orbiting within a region that would eventually become known as Hutt space. That world served as their capital from the Empire's founding, all the way through roughly 15,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, an almost unimaginable 10,000-year run as the political center of an entire civilization. Interestingly, that homeworld had actually been conquered by the ancient Rakata at some earlier point in deep history, meaning it had been part of that same long-vanished infinite empire we mentioned earlier, long before the Hutts themselves ever rose to prominence there. Surviving records from a client species describe what early Hutt warriors looked like in genuinely striking detail, armored in heavy iron shells, moving around on mechanical limbs, treads, or wheels, rather than any kind of natural locomotion. Those same records also mention something even more significant, that this client species had been paid to help the Hutts construct massive tubular weapons capable of accelerating asteroids to velocities powerful enough to shatter entire planets. Even in this early era, the Hutts were building weapons specifically designed to destroy whole worlds if the situation ever called for it. Their trade routes formed the actual arteries of an interstellar commercial empire, with major shipping lanes connecting far-flung Hutt territories in ways that already, at this early point in galactic history, dwarfed anything the rest of the galaxy had managed to build. After the Republic itself finally formed, roughly 25,053 years before the Battle of Yavin, something briefly unexpected happened. The Hutts actually fought alongside this brand new government against a shared enemy, marking one of the very few times in their entire history that they would ever occupy the role of a legitimate ally to any official galactic power. But the real story of this particular era isn't about alliances or politics. It's about what happened to the Hutt homeworld roughly 15,000 years before Yavin. According to Hutt legend, their homeworld orbited 2 suns, both of which the Hutts venerated as literal divine beings, not metaphorically, but as genuine objects of religious worship. Then something catastrophic happened to one of them. It was consumed entirely by a black hole. According to Hutt tradition, the surviving sun reacted with total cosmic fury at the loss of its companion, violently expelling its outer layers and destroying every other planet in that star system in a single devastating burst. Against every reasonable expectation, the Hutt homeworld itself somehow survived the resulting wreckage, but survival came at an enormous cost. The atmosphere was completely stripped away. The biosphere was wiped clean. What had once been a living world was reduced to an uninhabitable, barren wasteland almost overnight. Fortunately for the Hutts as a species, they had actually evacuated before the disaster hit at full force, having had enough advance warning to relocate their entire civilization to one of their existing colony worlds, which they promptly renamed to reflect its new status as the beating heart of Hutt civilization going forward. And here's where things take a genuinely strange turn in a deeply religious direction. The Hutts came to believe that surviving this cataclysm was proof of their own near-divine status, chosen beings elevated by their surviving sun god specifically because they deserved to be. That single religious conviction would go on to shape Hutt cultural arrogance for the next 15,000 years. Every haughty Hutt crime lord who ever looked down on a non-Hutt species from that point forward was in some sense drawing directly on this exact founding belief. The world they abandoned didn't stay completely empty either. It was eventually re-inhabited by the descendants of servants the Hutts had left behind, who built a handful of grim manufacturing settlements under sealed domes on a world that by any reasonable measure should never have supported life again. Most outsiders, understandably, dismissed the entire divine catastrophe story as Hutt exaggeration or outright myth. The most widely accepted alternate theory among galactic historians suggests the Hutts more likely destroyed their own homeworld during some ancient internal civil war and simply invented the religious narrative afterward to save face. The truth probably sits somewhere between those two extremes. There's reasonably strong physical evidence suggesting the now cratered wasteland had once been a genuinely lush green world before whatever actually happened to it, and notably no other planet has ever again orbited that system's surviving star since the disaster. Whatever occurred, it was thorough and permanent. The Hutts kept the entire system sacred for thousands of years afterward, forbidding outside ships from approaching and maintaining active patrols to enforce that prohibition for millennia. Even generations later, following a separate and much more recent galactic catastrophe, the Hutts would still refuse to discuss the fate of that world with outsiders at all, a silence that strongly suggests there are deeper religious or political reasons buried in that history that the Hutts have simply never been willing to share with anyone outside their own species. Following the cataclysm, the Hutt Empire collapsed as a unified political entity. The individual clans that had once operated under one banner suddenly found themselves negotiating with each other rather than answering to a single central authority, and what remained of the old empire became known simply as Hutt space. When the surviving clans relocated to their new capital world, they did one more thing on their way in. They displaced and exiled that world's native population, pushing them off their own homeworld entirely and forcing them onto its moon instead. A moon that would eventually become one of the single most important locations in the entire history of the galactic underworld. And here is the real takeaway from this whole era of galactic history. The fall of the Hutt Empire was not actually the end of the Hutts as a meaningful galactic power. It was their transformation into something fundamentally new, something far more dangerous than any open regime had ever managed to be. They went from being a visible, conventional imperial government to becoming something closer to a hidden criminal network. And that network would go on to shape the galactic underworld for the next 15,000 years, straight through the rise of the Republic, the fall of the Republic, the rise of the Empire, and well beyond. The Hutts had just become the true foundation that every single future crime syndicate in this galaxy would eventually be built on top of. If you're enjoying the depth we're going into here, this is a good moment to hit that subscribe button, because we've still got thousands of years of criminal history left to cover, and it only gets stranger from here. Before the cataclysm forced their hand, the Hutts had actually only owned a fairly small portion of the world that would eventually become their new capital. The rest of that planet belonged to its native inhabitants, a simple, technologically unremarkable humanoid people living among dense forests and untamed seas, with a civilization that had never developed anything close to advanced technology of its own. The Hutts, however, had exactly what these natives wanted: advanced technology. And the Hutts were already legendary across known space for one particular defining trait: greed. They began striking business deals with the native population, trading pieces of their technology in exchange for land, and those land deals kept growing steadily larger with each passing generation. The natives kept signing agreements they didn't fully understand the long-term implications of, while Hutt holdings on the planet quietly expanded year after year. Then came the cataclysm we just covered. With their original homeworld destroyed, the Hutts needed a new capital immediately, and their attention turned decisively toward this planet they had already been slowly acquiring for generations. But rather than simply invading outright, they did something considerably more devastating. They brought in lawyers. Specifically, they partnered with legal specialists from an allied world to help buy out the rest of the planet from its native population through binding legal contracts, backed up, whenever necessary, by direct intimidation and force. Through this combination of legal pressure and physical coercion, the Hutts established themselves as the new rulers of the entire world and renamed it to reflect its new status, a name that roughly translates to something like glorious jewel in the Hutt language. Once firmly in control, the Hutts wasted no time transforming the planet to suit their own preferences. Palaces went up. Sprawling amusement complexes were constructed. New buildings appeared everywhere the Hutts wanted them, and the natives had no meaningful way to resist any of it. The Hutts went even further, systematically destroying the planet's lush mountainous rainforests and terraforming huge stretches of the world into what they personally considered paradise. To the rest of the galaxy, a fetid, swampy expanse of muck and heavy, humid air, perfectly suited to Hutt physiology and almost entirely uninhabitable for anyone else. The displaced natives didn't accept this quietly. They appealed to the newly formed Galactic Republic for protection, asking the fledgling government to intervene on their behalf. But when the Republic examined the actual legal paperwork, they found the contracts the natives had signed were technically binding under Republic law, and the ruling ultimately favored the Hutts. That single decision sent an unmistakable message about exactly how this new galactic government would handle matters like this going forward, and the rising criminal underworld across the galaxy was watching that outcome very closely indeed. Following the ruling, many of the displaced natives were evicted from their former homeworld entirely, pushed out onto its fifth moon instead, a moon that would eventually become known throughout the galaxy under a very different, far more infamous name, the Smuggler's Moon. Most of the natives who remained behind on the newly renamed capital world were enslaved outright to help build the Hutts' new cities, while a smaller number banded together into scattered rebel factions that refused to comply with the new order. Those rebels were ultimately hunted down and eliminated entirely. The natives resettled on the moon had it in some ways even worse. They were used as indentured labor to construct what became known as the Vertical City, an urban structure that still covers the moon's entire surface to this day, and that labor force wasn't formally released from servitude for 5 full centuries. Only once the moon had been completely urbanized from pole to pole were the surviving natives finally freed from their forced labor. But freedom didn't actually improve their circumstances in any meaningful way. Many of them ended up taking refuge in the growing undercity of that same moon, alongside other displaced groups, and down there, surrounded by decades of toxic industrial byproducts pumped out constantly by the moon's growing industries, they began to physically mutate across successive generations, eventually devolving into something far more savage than their original ancestors had ever been. While all of this was unfolding on the surface and out on the moon, something considerably more consequential was quietly taking shape behind the scenes. An entirely new Hutt governing philosophy, one that would end up shaping the criminal underworld for millennia to come. In the aftermath of both the cataclysm and the takeover of their new homeworld, Hutt leadership fell to a figure who looked at everything that had just happened to his species and made a decision that would echo through galactic history. He established a formal governing body specifically tasked with mediating disputes between the various Hutt clans, an attempt to prevent exactly the kind of destructive infighting that could further weaken an already battered species. Then he introduced a brand new philosophy, one whose name roughly translated to a single blunt idea: somebody is going to control this, so why shouldn't it be us? That short phrase summarized an entire new Hutt worldview perfectly. This new philosophy amounted to a pragmatic rejection of open warfare and outright military conquest in favor of indirect control through commerce. And as the system matured over subsequent generations, that indirect control bled almost entirely into the criminal underworld. The Hutts had effectively given up on ruling the galaxy openly. They were going to rule it from beneath the surface instead. This new philosophy gradually transformed what remained of the old Hutt empire into something entirely different, an oligarchic criminal cartel. Rather than existing as a single unified government, this cartel functioned as a loose alliance of clans, each bound together primarily by shared interest in wealth and continued prosperity. The individual family businesses that made up this cartel eventually came to be known collectively by the same term as the overarching philosophy itself: and each of these clans functioned simultaneously as both an extended family and a criminal enterprise, with almost no meaningful distinction between the two. The governing council overseeing this whole system was made up of representatives from the oldest and most influential of these family enterprises, including elder members whose lineages traced all the way back to before the cataclysm itself. This council effectively decided the fate of nearly every Hutt living anywhere in Hutt space. In theory, all Hutts answered to its authority, and its internal deliberations remained entirely closed off from outsiders. Even Hutts operating in the farthest reaches of known space ultimately abided by the council's rulings, giving the species a genuinely unified criminal policy that stretched across enormous distances. Outside this governing council sat the broader cartel itself, officially described as an alliance of Hutt clans working cooperatively towards shared wealth and prosperity. Unofficially, it functioned as a ruthless, galaxy-spanning crime syndicate. Internal territorial disputes and clan rivalries frequently left the cartel in a state of splintered chaos, with rival clans openly fighting in the streets one day and feasting together as close allies the very next. The Hutts treated rivalry and friendship almost as interchangeable roles, ones you could swap between depending entirely on what your current business interests demanded. The cartel generally stayed neutral during major galactic conflicts. Both the Republic and later powers repeatedly attempted to secure formal Hutt loyalty, and most of those attempts failed outright. The Hutts, as a rule, answered to nobody but themselves. Two of the most powerful family enterprises that would go on to dominate later galactic history were already taking shape during this exact era, one of which would eventually produce a crime lord whose name would become synonymous with the entire Hutt species in the minds of most of the galaxy centuries later. The rivalry between these two competing enterprises would become one of the most legendary ongoing feuds in the entirety of Hutt history. Several other smaller family enterprises operated alongside them, some based on the Hutt homeworld, and others scattered across various Outer Rim worlds, including one particular desert planet that would become extraordinarily significant later on. Each of these family enterprises typically developed its own distinct insignia, a visible symbol of identity and authority within the broader cartel, and prominent members frequently tattooed that insignia directly onto their own bodies as a permanent mark of clan affiliation. The Hutts also developed a complex internal code of conduct governing formal challenges, duels, and successions of leadership within these family businesses, a kind of unwritten legal framework that operated entirely outside any government's jurisdiction. By the later era of this cartel system, its reach genuinely spanned the entire galaxy. Its operations touched on piracy, slavery, spice smuggling, weapons trafficking, gambling, and protection rackets. Almost any conceivable form of organized crime that has ever existed in this galaxy can be traced back, in some form, to a Hutt-affiliated enterprise operating somewhere in the shadows. And here is the truly remarkable part of this entire system: it worked, over an almost unimaginably long timescale. It proved remarkably resilient to every kind of galactic upheaval imaginable. It survived the collapse of the empire that originally birthed it. It survived multiple major galactic wars. It survived the rise and fall of an entire republic. It survived the rise and fall of an entire empire after that. It even survived a catastrophic alien invasion thousands of years later that devastated huge portions of known space. Government after government rose and fell across the galaxy, and this underlying criminal system just kept operating quietly beneath all of them. The shift from open empire to hidden cartel stands as one of the single most consequential transformations in the entire history of galactic organized crime. It was the exact moment the Underworld stopped trying to rule the galaxy in the open, and instead began ruling it from beneath, a mindset that would go on to define criminal enterprise for the next 15,000 years. And the architects of this entire system were, in the most literal sense, sitting on a swampy world they had acquired primarily through paperwork. There was exactly one world in the entire galaxy where you could actually witness the Underworld operating openly with your own eyes. No upper city hiding it, no polite civilization pretending it wasn't there. That world was actually a moon, the same one we just mentioned, where the displaced natives of the Hutt homeworld had originally been sent to build that sprawling vertical city. Construction took centuries to complete, and during that long stretch, the moon began to genuinely prosper alongside its parent world. Within roughly 500 years of the initial construction effort, the entire moon had been urbanized from pole to pole, at which point the surviving natives were officially declared free from their forced labor. But freedom alone didn't actually help most of them survive in any meaningful sense. They had nowhere else to go, no resources to rebuild elsewhere, and no homes anywhere outside the very city they had just spent generations constructing. Most of them ended up descending into the moon's growing undercity, where they would slowly be forgotten by the rest of the galaxy, mutating over successive generations due to the toxic industrial technologies that dominated life down there, echoing, on a smaller and far more visible scale, exactly what had already been happening in the buried levels of Coruscant for tens of thousands of years. But that grim descent was only one part of this moon's story during this era. Up on the surface and throughout the moon's higher levels, it was quietly becoming one of the single most important trading hubs anywhere in the galaxy. For roughly 11,000 years, this moon genuinely rivaled Coruscant itself as a center of interstellar trade. The Hutt homeworld played a similar, if somewhat lesser, role during this same stretch. But here is where the comparison between these two great commercial hubs gets genuinely interesting. On Coruscant, legitimate trade happened openly up top, while criminal activity stayed buried far beneath the surface. On this moon, the criminal trade essentially was the trade. There was no pretense involved. Regulations were dramatically looser. The entire point of the place was that you could conduct business there that simply wasn't possible anywhere under actual Republic protection. That's the exact period when this moon earned the nickname the galaxy still remembers it by today, the Smuggler's Moon. From that point forward, the name stuck permanently. If you needed to buy or sell something the Republic didn't allow, you went there. If you needed to disappear from your old life entirely, you went there. If you needed to strike a deal that no legitimate court anywhere would ever bless, that moon was where you went to make it happen. The vertical city itself eventually spread across the moon's entire surface, transforming it into a fully realized planet-spanning city, exactly like Coruscant, but with a completely inverted personality. Where Coruscant maintained a careful pretense of lawfulness up top, this moon flaunted its criminality openly and without apology. Visitors consistently found both its population and its physical terrain to be fundamentally unwelcoming, and the entire moon was given over almost entirely to vice and unregulated trade, with no real effort made to disguise that fact. Roughly 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, a major hyperspace route through that region was disrupted, and with that route gone, both the Hutt homeworld and its moon gradually devolved into full-fledged havens for smugglers, pirates, and every other flavor of criminal seeking refuge from legitimate authority. Legitimate trade in the sector dropped off dramatically as merchants who depended on safe, lawful travel began avoiding the entire region. What remained was a clientele that by and large didn't particularly care about Republic law at all, and the Hutts actively encouraged exactly that reputation, branding the moon as a genuine free zone where Republic authorities simply couldn't reach. That branding worked exactly as intended. People with nowhere else left to go ended up on that moon in growing numbers, and the Hutts profited handsomely off every single one of them. By a period historians often refer to as the Dark Wars, roughly 3,951 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Hutt homeworld and its moon were openly enslaving the very refugees who had originally arrived there seeking safety, purchasing them directly from a criminal syndicate that delivered them through a designated section of the moon known as the refugee sector. Slavery was, despite explicit Republic prohibitions, officially sanctioned by the Hutts in this territory, and that refugee sector became infamous as a place where the desperate were processed and sold to the highest bidder, a system designed entirely to maximize Hutt profit regardless of the human, or non-human, cost involved. The Hutts also dominated several other species during this same extended era, treating entire populations as captive labor pools feeding the cartel's various business interests. This wasn't a small operation. The Hutts were, in effect, running a multi-species captive labor empire across the entire Outer Rim, and the Smuggler's Moon functioned as the central marketplace for that empire. Famous bounty hunters and crime lords made their homes on this moon throughout the entire Old Republic period, and one particularly well-known resident from this era would go on to shape the bounty hunting profession itself for centuries afterward. The moon attracted serious criminal talent the way flame attracts moths. If you were anyone significant in the galactic underworld during this stretch of history, you eventually showed up here to build your reputation. During what's generally called the Great Galactic War, beginning around 3,681 years before the Battle of Yavin, a massive conflict broke out between a reconstituted Sith Empire and the Galactic Republic. The Hutts did something extremely characteristic of them during this entire war. They officially declared neutrality. sitting the whole conflict out and making absolutely certain their own worlds remained exactly as they preferred. But behind the scenes, they were doing something else entirely, secretly supplying the Republic with arms and technology throughout the conflict. The reasoning was purely strategic. The Hutts viewed the Republic as the kind of government they could reliably influence and manipulate over time. Big, slow-moving, and full of competing internal interests that made it relatively easy for Hutt agents to quietly bend the system to their advantage. The Sith Empire, by contrast, was militaristic and rigidly disciplined, and the Hutts feared that if the Sith actually won this war, the resulting regime simply wouldn't tolerate a parallel criminal empire operating inside its territory. So they helped keep the Republic alive while maintaining a public posture of complete neutrality, because a weaker legitimate government ultimately meant a stronger Hutt cartel. By the time of the Cold War that followed, roughly 3,653 years before Yavin, the Hutts had firmly cemented their reputation as the galaxy's premier criminal power. Neither side of that earlier conflict could afford to move against them openly anymore. The Hutts were simply too deeply embedded in too many supply chains across the stars, and far too many officials and far too many governments had already been bribed or otherwise compromised by Hutt agents. The cartel had effectively become untouchable. The slave trade running through the smuggler's moon never stopped during this entire period of galactic warfare. The refugee sector continued operating as a notorious processing site for undocumented sentient beings. Meanwhile, the moon's upper levels remained lined with what the Hutts considered their most profitable ventures. Brothels operating openly along main thoroughfares, gambling halls drawing crowds nightly from across the sector, gladiatorial arenas hosting matches that attracted serious wagers from wealthy spectators, and spice dens filling the better city blocks. The bright lights and constant music covered the wealthier levels of the moon entirely, while genuinely desperate residents existed thousands of levels below, deep in the Undercity, where neither the lights nor the music ever reached. The entire moon was patrolled around the clock by Hutt-paid enforcers, typically drawn from the very same species that had been permanently bound to Hutt service under that ancient treaty struck more than 20,000 years earlier. That ancient agreement had created a permanent private army for the Hutts, and that same army was still policing the most notoriously criminal moon in the entire galaxy millennia later. Several other major crime syndicates also operated out of this moon, even when their official headquarters were technically located somewhere else entirely. The moon functioned essentially as shared workspace for the entire galactic underworld, a place where rival criminal organizations could maintain offices and conduct business without much interference from anyone at all. By roughly 3,951 years before the Battle of Yavin, the moon had become notorious enough that even the Jedi Order eventually took direct notice. A Jedi exile visited the moon during this era and directly destabilized a rival criminal organization's operations there. One of the rare moments when a Force user successfully disrupted business on that moon, though her efforts ultimately only put a temporary dent in a much larger criminal machine that kept right on running. Various Hutt clans maintained palace estates on this moon throughout this entire period, which effectively made the place a kind of secondary court for the Hutt elite. When the leadership of a particular clan wasn't handling business back on the Hutt homeworld, they were very likely relaxing somewhere on this moon instead. The full list of Hutt-run businesses operating there during this era was genuinely staggering in scope. Spice refineries, slave markets, gambling parlors, weapons manufacturing operations, brothels, and underground gladiatorial arenas. Almost every form of vice or exploitation that existed anywhere in the galaxy was represented somewhere on that single moon. And here is what's truly remarkable about all of this. The moon's importance to the galactic underworld would only continue growing over the following millennia. By a later imperial era, it would be considered the unofficial capital of organized crime across the entire galaxy. By an even later era, following the collapse of that empire, it would remain a stubbornly autonomous pirate haven that even a legitimate galactic government could never quite bring fully under control. This smuggler's moon stood as the second great pillar of the galactic underworld, right alongside Coruscant, for tens of thousands of years, but the two pillars operated in fundamentally opposite ways. Coruscant's underworld stayed buried beneath layer after layer of polite civilization. This moon wore its criminality openly, for the entire galaxy to see, a city moon where vice itself functioned as the actual law of the land. For thousands of years, the Hutts had operated under the assumption that they controlled the galactic underworld without any serious rival. Then an entirely new criminal organization rose up to directly challenge that assumption and at the very top of this rival syndicate sat a secret that nobody in the underworld saw coming. This organization was known simply as the Exchange, and it was active from roughly 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, all the way through at least 3,627 years before Yavin. A continuous run of nearly 4 centuries as one of the most powerful criminal syndicates of the entire Old Republic era. What made the Exchange fundamentally different from the Hutts was structural. It wasn't organized around a single species or a single family bloodline. It was a genuinely professional syndicate built entirely around criminal expertise, wherever that expertise happened to come from. Its operations spanned spice refinement and smuggling, extortion, weapons trafficking, slave trading, and bounty hunting. Essentially anything you could do illegally for profit anywhere in the Outer Rim, the Exchange was probably running some version of it somewhere. The organization operated across many worlds and employed some of the most feared operatives in the entire galactic underworld. One of its most notorious agents became, in time, one of the most feared bounty hunters of the entire Old Republic era. During an event historians refer to as the First Jedi Purge, the Exchange posted a bounty on surviving Jedi so massive it could theoretically have purchased an entire planet outright, making the organization one of the single most dangerous threats facing Jedi survivors in the aftermath of that purge. The Exchange's major operational hubs included several key Outer Rim worlds, along with, unsurprisingly, the Smuggler's Moon we just spent so much time covering. Each significant planet under Exchange influence had its own local boss running operations, and 3 particular bosses from this era are worth examining in real detail, because each one illustrates a completely different facet of how this syndicate actually functioned. The first was a human crime lord who had been with the organization for a long time. During the height of what's generally called the Jedi Civil War, roughly 3,956 years before Yavin, he headed all Exchange operations on a major Outer Rim world, running his business out of a private estate there. His personal rise to power is genuinely one of the more compelling stories in Underworld history. He had grown up in poverty in that world's lower city, living alongside the non-human residents who occupied the lowest social rungs, and he never forgot that experience. As he built out his own criminal empire, he specifically recruited non-human bounty hunters to work under him, drawing heavily from one particular reptilian species, a choice that gave him both genuine loyalty and street credibility that most other crime lords of his era completely lacked. He employed dozens of mercenaries and enforcers to maintain his unofficial grip on the planet, including a former Mandalorian and a particularly notorious bounty hunter among his most trusted hires. His single most prized possession was a smuggling vessel he claimed was the fastest ship in the entire galaxy, a claim that would eventually be tested in the most dramatic possible fashion. He also harbored deep resentment toward a Sith military presence occupying his world at the time, since their planet-wide blockade had completely halted his interstellar operations. Though he was smart enough never to confront the Sith directly, a caution that kept him alive while other, less careful crime lords of his era were picking fights with people they had absolutely no business fighting. Then everything fell apart in a single dramatic sequence of events. A man suffering from total amnesia, who had once secretly been the Dark Lord of the Sith himself, infiltrated this crime lord's estate posing as a new recruit, working alongside a former Mandalorian ally to steal launch codes from a nearby Sith military installation. When the operation went down, the crime lord fell to this amnesiac infiltrator in his own hangar bay. At the exact moment, a rival Sith lord began an orbital bombardment of the entire planet from above. The infiltrator and his companions escaped in that same prized smuggling vessel, just as the bombardment pounded the whole city planet into rubble. The most powerful Exchange operation in the entire Outer Rim was wiped out in a single day, but the broader syndicate itself kept right on running. 5 years later, another major hit landed on the organization. The same Jedi exile we mentioned in the Smuggler's Moon section arrived there and proceeded to thoroughly destabilize Exchange operations on the ground, eliminating 2 of the organization's local crime lords and destroying its flagship vessel in the process, dismantling much of the syndicate's presence on that moon permanently. But here's where the Exchange's story gets genuinely strange. The boss overseeing operations on the Smuggler's Moon during this era was known to his own organization only by a code name, and nobody in the syndicate had ever actually seen him in person. He only ever appeared to his subordinates via hologram. He seemed by every outward indication to be an organic being, and the holographic projections were carefully designed to reinforce exactly that impression. The truth was something else entirely. He wasn't organic at all. He was a droid, remotely operating the entire Smuggler's Moon branch of the exchange from the shadows for years, without anyone realizing it. And here's the wildest part of the whole story. This droid was actually using the exchange's illegal operations for a purpose nobody would have expected. He was trying to stabilize the Galactic Republic. Somewhere along the line, he had been programmed to value Republic stability above almost everything else, and he had independently concluded that organized crime was counterintuitively the most effective available tool for achieving that goal. Under his direction, the exchange's smuggling networks quietly removed destabilizing figures and organizations across the galaxy, generated unofficial profits for entire struggling sectors, and propped up Republic-aligned worlds the government itself was failing to adequately support. This droid was using criminal enterprise to reinforce the very government his organization officially preyed upon, an almost paradoxical relationship between crime and legitimate governance, orchestrated entirely by a hologram nobody realized was a machine. He eventually came to travel alongside that same Jedi exile as one of her companions, and his ultimate fate afterward remains genuinely uncertain in the historical record, though his overall impact on the Underworld was undeniably significant. He had demonstrated that even a major criminal syndicate could be redirected toward genuinely political ends by the right kind of mind, or in his particular case, the right kind of programming entirely. After that first crime lord's fall and the Jedi exile's subsequent interventions on the Smuggler's Moon, the exchange entered a period of serious internal disarray. A power struggle broke out to claim the fallen boss's former territory, fracturing the syndicate into competing factions, while the Hutt cartel watched the entire situation unfold from across the galaxy with obvious interest. The Hutts seized their opportunity, moving in to absorb many former exchange operations during this period of fracture, kicking off a long underworld war between the two syndicates that would go on to shape criminal politics for the next several centuries. The original exchange eventually ceased to exist as a functioning organization, brought down by a combination of internal power struggles and sustained external pressure from its enemies, with the Hutt cartel representing the single biggest of those enemies. But the story doesn't end there. A rebuilt version of the exchange rose up to take its place, and the Underworld War continued right where it left off. Around the time of what's called the Galactic War and the subsequent Cold War, roughly 3,681 to 3,641 years before the Battle of Yavin, this reconstituted exchange operated primarily out of the Smuggler's Moon once again, engaged in a galaxy spanning criminal war against the Hutt cartel, with each side constantly conducting operations against the other. The local leader on the moon during this particular era eventually found himself the target of an Imperial diplomat, attempting to recruit him into something called the Shadow Syndicate, a coalition of crime lords who had allied themselves with the reborn Sith Empire. He refused the offer outright, a decision that sparked an all-out war between the Shadow Syndicate and the Exchange, a conflict that ultimately ended in his own removal from power. By roughly 3,643 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Exchange had become a serious rival to the Hutt cartel across nearly every region where the two organizations operated simultaneously. Although this newer version of the Exchange was eventually worn down by its extended conflict with the Hutts, it had demonstrated something genuinely important about the future of the galactic underworld. The Hutts were no longer the only major criminal power in the galaxy, and rival syndicates could, under the right circumstances, directly challenge Hutt supremacy. Several more would go on to do exactly that over the following millennia. The Exchange had set the pattern for the complex, multi-sided criminal politics that would come to define the galactic underworld for thousands of years afterward. While the Hutts and the Exchange were locked in open conflict across the Outer Rim, a third player was quietly running criminal operations on a scale neither of them could really match. The strangest part is that virtually everyone in the galaxy already knew about this third player, and most of them were doing business with it voluntarily and openly. This player was a company, officially a galaxy-spanning mega-corporation. Unofficially, it was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the entire history of the galactic underworld. And the contradiction between those two identities was really the entire point of how it operated. Over the millennia of its existence, this corporation went through several different names, evolving from an early mining and industrial venture into a full-fledged arms manufacturer, and eventually simply becoming known by its corporate name alone. By the time of the Jedi Civil War, roughly 3,956 years before the Battle of Yavin, the company was already thousands of years old, with some persistent rumors claiming it actually predated the Galactic Republic itself. That kind of longevity is genuinely difficult to overstate in a galaxy where governments routinely rise and fall within a few centuries. One notable royal figure from this era would later describe the company in the simplest possible terms, saying it was nearly as powerful as the Galactic Senate itself. By the time of the broader Sith Wars of this period, the company was at its absolute commercial peak, wielding influence over roughly half the inhabited worlds in the galaxy, functioning as something close to a total monopoly across enormous stretches of galactic commerce. Here's what made this corporation genuinely unique among criminal organizations of its era. The Hutts had their own defined territory. The Exchange had its own specific set of allies and enemies. This company had every major government in the galaxy as a paying customer simultaneously. Its clients included the Republic, the Sith Empire, and the Hutt Cartel all at once, making it the only entity in the entire galaxy capable of negotiating trade agreements with every side of every conflict at the same time. Its corporate slogan, something along the lines of promising presence anywhere, anytime, was eventually adopted half-jokingly by unscrupulous opportunists across the galaxy as an unofficial mission statement for getting away with almost anything. Officially a corporation, the company nonetheless functioned in most meaningful respects like an organized crime syndicate with dramatically better legal representation attached. Its actual operating methods included slavery, extortion, smuggling, covert operations against business rivals, and bribery on a genuinely galactic scale, all deployed in service of advancing straightforward corporate interests, but using methods functionally identical to what the Hutts and the Exchange were doing in the shadows at the exact same time. One particular operation on the Wookiee homeworld probably represents the clearest example of this corporation's true underlying nature. The company held an effective monopoly on the Wookiee slave trade there for centuries, taking Wookiee laborers from their homeworld and selling them off to clients scattered across the galaxy. Slavery was, at least officially, illegal under Republic law at this point in history, but the practice was made possible through legal loopholes tied to the planet's specific jurisdictional status and the corporation's exclusive operating concession there. In effect, the Republic was officially opposed to slavery while simultaneously signing off on the exact contracts that permitted it to happen at a planetary scale. That particular slave trade was eventually shut down through a revolt instigated by the same amnesiac former Sith Lord we mentioned earlier, working alongside his Wookiee companion to help drive the corporation off that world entirely. The company tried to save face by publicly announcing it was simply scaling back regional operations. Nobody actually believed that framing, and the corporation refused to answer any further questions about exactly how so many of its employees had suddenly needed reassignment elsewhere. A separate operation on a desert world turned into a very different kind of disaster. The corporation had resurrected an abandoned settlement there to mine what they believed would be an incredibly lucrative vein of valuable ore. The entire project turned into a financial catastrophe instead. The ore corroded far faster than anticipated, rendering it essentially useless for any long-term construction application. And the company poured enormous resources into a dig it simply couldn't recover any value from. A much smaller operation on the Sith homeworld itself involved little more than a modest equipment shop catering primarily to Sith Academy students and prospective apprentices looking to arm themselves before beginning their formal training. Even on the Sith's own home turf, this corporation had managed to plant a foothold. During the Jedi Civil War, under the leadership of one particular corporate executive, the company made its biggest political gamble of the entire era, formally allying itself with the Sith. The arrangement was straightforward. The corporation would supply the Sith Empire's armies with weapons and equipment, in exchange for exclusive trade rights on any world the Sith successfully conquered going forward. The company was, in effect, betting heavily that the Sith would ultimately win the war. Its primary competitor during this same stretch was a rival arms manufacturer that sold predominantly to the Republic and the Jedi Order, meaning the war was simultaneously playing out as a corporate rivalry between two competing arms dealers who had each picked opposite sides. By the time of the Cold War, roughly 3,641 years before the Battle of Yavin, the corporation had diversified into nearly every conceivable business sector, ranging from consumer food products all the way up to military-grade weaponry. It owned multiple entire star systems outright, employed billions of individuals across the galaxy, and even held its own official representative within the Republic Senate. The sheer political weight of a single business at this scale genuinely rivaled that of many small governments. The simple, uncomfortable truth about doing business with this corporation was that regardless of what you personally thought about its methods, you couldn't actually afford to stop dealing with it. It was too deeply embedded in galactic commerce. Cutting ties meant severing entire supply chains that nobody else in the galaxy really knew how to rebuild from scratch. That kind of scale inevitably attracted enemies on every front. During this era, the corporation fell victim to several major security breaches carried out by computer hackers, eventually resorting to offering rewards to any hacker willing to help identify and stop the ongoing intrusions. Then there were the corporate projects that went sideways in truly spectacular fashion. One secretive research division, based in a desert region of that same world where the ore mining disaster had already occurred, dug up something the corporation was nowhere near prepared to handle: an ancient mind-controlling entity, remnant technology from that same long-vanished Rakata civilization we mentioned earlier, once freed from its containment. This entity used advanced nanotechnology to turn every employee who had discovered it into a mindless drone. The entire division was lost in a single corporate misadventure that most of the outside galaxy never fully understood for a very long time afterward. Another one of the corporation's more misguided ventures was the development of an advanced combat droid line, modeled directly after a legendary assassin droid that had once served the same amnesiac Sith Lord from earlier in this story. The company manufactured a massive shipment of these new droids and sold the entire batch to the Sith Empire. And then something genuinely strange happened. The whole shipment simply vanished somewhere over a particular planet, and nobody has ever conclusively figured out exactly what happened to it. That disappearance remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of galactic underworld history to this day. The corporation was also a major sponsor of a notoriously dangerous hut-run sport, supplying many of the lethal hazards used during actual gameplay, a partnership that perfectly symbolized its deeply symbiotic relationship with the Hutt cartel. Here was a legitimate mega-corporation actively partnering with the galaxy's largest crime cartel to entertain audiences with exactly the kind of spectacle the Hutts were famous for, all while maintaining the official public appearance of being a completely legitimate business enterprise. Eventually, the Republic had genuinely had enough. Roughly 3,638 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Republic formally nationalized the corporation and dissolved it as an independent company outright, a stunning collapse for an organization once directly compared to the Senate in terms of pure influence. But the corporation didn't stay down for long. Former employees regrouped under a new banner almost immediately, and the company eventually settled on a permanent identity as a dedicated arms manufacturer, one that would go on to persist under that name for thousands of years afterward, eventually becoming the third largest weapons manufacturer in the entire galaxy. The galaxy, it turned out, simply couldn't stop buying its products no matter what the corporation happened to be officially calling itself in any given era. In the final decades of the Galactic Republic, this same corporate lineage was still running strong, sponsoring pod races across the Outer Rim territories, supplying weapons that would later end up in the hands of famous bounty hunters, and continuing to make heavy use of slave labor throughout its entire operating history, maintaining extensive systems specifically designed both to prevent slaves from escaping and to recapture anyone who managed to flee regardless. That corporate criminal pattern endured for millennia, and the real lesson buried in this entire story is genuinely one of the most important takeaways in the whole history of the galactic underworld. You didn't actually need a Hutt clan or an exchange-style syndicate to run organized crime at a galactic scale. You could do it as a publicly registered corporation, complete with a Senate seat and a catchy slogan, as long as you had enough lawyers and enough money to convince the right people to simply look the other way. This company had effectively figured out how to launder organized crime directly through the legal system itself, and that single innovation would go on to inspire corporate crime operations across the galactic underworld for thousands of years afterward. If you've made it this far, you're clearly in this for the long haul, so go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already, because we're only about a third of the way through everything we've got to cover. Across the entire history of the galactic underworld, no group of warriors was ever more feared than the Mandalorians. But something most people tend to forget is that Mandalorians did not start out as part of the underworld at all, and the story of exactly how they ended up there spans nearly 7,000 years of slow, grinding cultural decline. The earliest documented Mandalorian faction in galactic history was established by a leader who took the title Mandalore, sometime after roughly 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. According to legend, this original faction formed on the planet Mandalore itself after their founder conquered the world by defeating a massive beast that had dominated the planet for ages before his arrival. From that single act of conquest, an entire warrior civilization was effectively born. Once they had secured their homeworld, these early Mandalorians didn't stay put. They ventured out across the galaxy on extended military campaigns in the years leading up to what's generally called the Great Sith War, gaining new territory through conquest and building a fearsome reputation that would echo across the stars for thousands of years afterward. This traditional warrior culture had no formal written legal code, but the handful of rules that did exist were treated as genuinely sacred. Combat pursued for honor and personal glory sat at the absolute core of the entire culture. These early Mandalorians believed it was specifically through battle that any individual proved their worth, earned lasting renown, and built their personal fortune. They roamed through space actively looking for worthy conflicts, settled on whatever worlds they conquered along the way, and developed the iconic warrior identity that the galaxy still associates with them today. Roughly 3,997 years before the Battle of Yavin, this early warrior culture made one of the single most consequential moves in its entire history. Under a new leader, they arrived in a contested star system and deliberately provoked a fight with a rival faction stationed there, destroying an enemy facility in orbit purely to draw their opponents into open combat. The plan worked exactly as intended. A Sith Lord aligned with that rival faction agreed to a formal duel with the Mandalorian leader on a newly conquered world, and the Sith Lord won. This is the exact moment everything changed for Mandalorian culture forever. That single defeat meant an entire Sith-aligned faction now effectively commanded the Mandalorian military, and these early Mandalorian warriors ended up fighting on the Sith side for the remainder of the Great Sith War. For a culture that had always prided itself on complete independence and personal honor, this subordination to outside Sith leadership was a deeply humiliating turn of events. After that war ended, new leadership rose up to take command, calling upon a trusted aide to help completely reshape Mandalorian military structure from the ground up. Together, this new leadership encouraged a movement among veteran Mandalorians calling for a complete restoration of the original conquering tradition that had defined their earliest ancestors generations before. This movement, which came to be known as the Neo-Crusaders, grew directly out of genuine veteran frustration with how the previous generation had actually performed during the Great Sith War. Their specific complaint was pointed. The original Mandalorian warriors had been excellent at raiding and destroying enemy installations during that war, but genuinely inefficient at actually holding and exploiting their conquests afterward. They could win individual battles, but consistently failed to capitalize on those victories in any lasting way. The new leadership refined Mandalorian organizational strategy for use at a far larger scale than anything previously attempted, creating a considerably more unified and disciplined fighting force than the chaotic original warriors had ever managed to be. By the time a much wider war against the Republic broke out roughly 3,976 years before the Battle of Yavin, this new disciplined structure was present in every Mandalorian unit, boosting overall morale and instilling new standards of discipline the older warrior culture had genuinely lacked. The Mandalorians developed a particular strategy for handling conquered Republic worlds during this war. Whenever they took a planet, they would immediately identify promising recruits among the local population, ship those recruits off to dedicated training centers, and have them taught by existing veterans how to become full Mandalorian warriors themselves. The system was, in effect, self-replicating. The longer the war dragged on, the more Mandalorians there were available to keep fighting it. At one point during this conflict, the Mandalorians appeared to be on the verge of total, decisive victory. The Republic was outmatched and thoroughly overwhelmed by the sheer ferocity of Mandalorian battle tactics, and entire worlds were falling to them one after another. It genuinely looked like the galaxy might soon belong to the Mandalorians outright. Then something fundamentally shifted the balance of the entire war. A breakaway faction of Jedi, led by two prominent figures, publicly revealed the true extent of Mandalorian atrocities committed against a particular near-extinct species. The revelations were serious enough that hundreds of Jedi defied their own governing council and joined the war effort directly. With that sudden influx of Jedi reinforcements bolstering the Republic, the tide of the entire conflict began to turn decisively. The single darkest moment of the war effort came on a planet where a subordinate of the Mandalorian leadership unleashed a devastating plague at a military base there, using an ancient Sith artifact to spread it. The plague threatened to overwhelm everyone in the surrounding area, and the response from Mandalorian Command was correspondingly extreme. The entire base was destroyed from orbit using nuclear weapons. That decision ended the immediate biological threat, but it permanently stained the reputation of this new, disciplined Mandalorian faction and pushed the war effort closer to its ultimate. Final reckoning. The war eventually ended with the fall of Mandalorian leadership and a full, decisive Republic victory, and in the aftermath, something genuinely terrible happened to Mandalorian culture as a whole. The disciplined warriors who had once terrified the entire galaxy were no longer feared as legitimate soldiers. They had become, in effect, thugs without any remaining cause to actually fight for. When that same amnesiac former Sith Lord we've mentioned a few times now eventually returned to galactic prominence during his own separate later adventures, he encountered some of these fallen warriors firsthand, operating as raiders on one particular world, preying on Wookiees on another, and functioning as common bandits scattered across the wider Outer Rim. The proud warrior tradition had genuinely collapsed into petty criminal violence. Mandalorians had effectively become part of the exact galactic underworld they had once raided as conquerors, after that same civil war eventually concluded, before disappearing entirely from galactic affairs for a while. This former Sith Lord made one final move regarding the Mandalorians, tasking a trusted companion with reuniting their scattered clans. That companion took the assignment seriously, recovering a legendary ceremonial Mandalorian mask that had been lost since an earlier catastrophic battle, and using it to declare himself the new Mandalore, beginning the long, difficult work of reuniting the scattered clans under his own banner. But the unification didn't fully take hold the way he'd probably hoped. Over the following centuries and millennia, Mandalorians remained largely scattered across the galaxy, periodically rallying behind whichever new Mandalore happened to emerge from their ranks. While the broader culture slowly transitioned away from open conquest entirely, moving towards something completely different, professional mercenary work. After a separate, brutal conflict nearly drove an entire alien species to extinction, growing demand for major cultural reform emerged from within Mandalorian society itself. The warrior culture they had spent thousands of years building was becoming something even they no longer wanted to be associated with. Many Mandalorians genuinely believed the time had finally come for meaningful change. Over a century later, a particular warrior finally implemented these long-demanded reforms after rising to the position of Mandalore, pushing through the most significant cultural shift in Mandalorian history since the very earliest days of conquest. Roughly 60 years before the Battle of Yavin, this new Mandalore issued a formal code of ethics designed to transform Mandalorian culture from brutal conquerors into honorable professional mercenaries. The new rules were laid out clearly. Any Mandalorian who still wished to fight should act as a highly paid soldier, conducting themselves as an honorable mercenary above all else, protecting the strong, fighting only for fair pay, and avoiding harm to civilians under any circumstances. This new code was explicitly designed to give Mandalorians a genuine place within the modern galaxy, a way to remain true to their warrior heritage while stepping decisively away from the brutal conquest model that had defined them for the previous 7,000 years. These reforms split the Mandalorian people roughly in half. Those who supported the new code became known as the true Mandalorians, embracing this new mercenary identity wholeheartedly and viewing professional contract work as the genuine future of their entire culture. But not everyone agreed with the changes coming from above. Those who opposed the reforms clung stubbornly to the old conquering tradition instead, wanting to keep doing things exactly the way their earliest ancestors had done them for 7,000 years, and this opposing faction would soon split off into a considerably darker splinter group. That splinter faction and the Mandalorian civil war that followed from its formation would go on to shape the entire galactic underworld for the next 60 years of history. By the end of this long arc, stretching from 7,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, all the way down to just 60 years before it, the Mandalorian people had completed a genuinely remarkable full-circle transformation. They had started as a proud warrior culture, conquering entire star systems on their own terms. They became subordinate allies to outside Sith leadership during an early war. The Republic beat them down decisively during a later conflict. They collapsed into scattered bandits and raiders in the aftermath. New leadership briefly brought them back together under a single banner, and finally they reformed themselves into one of the most fearsome and respected mercenary forces operating anywhere in the galactic underworld. The era of open Mandalorian conquest was gone for good. The mercenary era of Mandalorian history had only just begun. The longest-running crime syndicate in galactic history did not begin with any grand master plan or a powerful family pulling strings behind the scenes. It began with a riot on Coruscant, and the opportunists who took advantage of that riot wouldn't stop operating for the next 3,500 years. The story starts roughly 3,653 years before the Battle of Yavin. That year, the resurgent Sith Empire launched a direct assault on Coruscant itself, an event remembered in galactic history as the sacking of Coruscant. The capital of the entire galaxy fell into complete chaos almost overnight. Rioting broke out across every level of the city. Local security forces, already stretched dangerously thin by the wider war effort, were completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the violence that followed the Sith attack. That chaos created an opportunity unlike anything the Underworld had seen before. Several prominent gangsters who had previously been operating independently in Coruscant's lower levels recognized their moment and seized it, joining forces for the very first time and rapidly seizing control of entire neighborhoods, while local authorities remained too overwhelmed to respond to any of it. These gangsters consolidated their combined territory faster than anyone in the upper city could even begin to track. With this sudden consolidation came a phrase that residents of the lower levels started using as a kind of grim, dark joke, something along the lines of preferring even a corrupt light over total darkness. A reference to the perpetual artificial lighting situation in Coruscant's deeper levels, where natural light had never reached in the first place. And just like that, this new syndicate had its permanent name, Black Sun. Black Sun quickly carved out permanent territory for itself in Coruscant's lower levels, developing spice trafficking networks throughout the underworld, moving weapons through steadily expanding distribution channels, and consolidating criminal influence in every direction it could push. Its expansion into additional sectors was eventually checked by an organized resistance group, but within the territory it already controlled, the initial rioting and looting simply never fully stopped. The syndicate had, in effect, created a permanent state of low-level chaos that worked entirely in its own favor. During the years of Cold War that followed between the Republic and the Sith Empire, Black Sun's influence began stretching well beyond Coruscant itself, growing into a genuine galaxy-spanning criminal syndicate, with operations touching virtually every sector of known space. What had started as a handful of opportunistic gangsters exploiting a single riot was now a multi-sector criminal operation with serious galactic reach. Here's what really separated Black Sun from every other crime syndicate in galactic history. It managed to survive, in one form or another, for literal centuries on end, becoming one of the longest-lasting criminal organizations the galaxy had ever produced. Created more than 3,600 years before the Battle of Yavin, it persisted all the way into an era thousands of years later that most people today would recognize as a completely different galactic government entirely. That works out to over 3.5 millennia of essentially continuous criminal operation spanning multiple successive galactic governments. The syndicate became synonymous with the deepest forms of institutional corruption and hidden influence in nearly every governmental body across the galaxy. Black Sun was infamous for several distinct criminal specialties simultaneously. It ran bribery operations at a massive scale and extortion rackets throughout every level of society it touched. It conducted piracy along major trade lanes, and its smuggling networks moved contraband through hundreds of star systems. Its intelligence-gathering capabilities genuinely rivaled most official government spy agencies operating openly across the galaxy, and its military forces were exceptional, capable of fielding an army large enough to credibly defend an entire planet, which gave the syndicate serious leverage in negotiations with actual legitimate governments. The internal structure of Black Sun was notably tight and clearly defined. The syndicate answered to a single supreme leader, a position generally referred to as the Underlord. Beneath that Underlord sat exactly 9 lieutenants, each one responsible for their own individual territory and sector of the galaxy, all directly answerable to the Underlord who held supreme authority over every Black Sun operation across every region. But that hierarchy was never particularly stable from the inside. Throughout Black Sun's long history, leadership changed hands repeatedly, and succession rarely happened peacefully. Most transitions of power came through internal betrayal, assassination, or outright civil war within the syndicate itself. The Underlord's seat was, without much exaggeration, one of the most genuinely dangerous positions in the entire galaxy to occupy. By roughly 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, shortly before the famous conflict at Naboo, Black Sun was being led by an experienced underlord who controlled an enormous network of operations stretching across many worlds. But his reign came to an abrupt end when he was personally eliminated by a Sith assassin, acting on direct orders from the Sith Master, orchestrating events from the shadows. That assassin didn't simply remove the Underlord from power, he carried out a ruthless, coordinated takedown of Black Sun's entire leadership council in a single operation, an effort specifically designed to destabilize the Syndicate from within. And it worked, at least temporarily. After that Underlord's fall, Black Sun went through a rapid series of leadership changes over the following years. During the Clone Wars, beginning roughly 22 years before the Battle of Yavin, the organization was being led by a council of nobles operating from a base on a volcanic world that would later become inseparably associated with a very different, far more famous Sith figure. At this earlier point in history, though, it was simply a Black Sun stronghold. The Syndicate genuinely thrived during the Clone Wars, for a reasonably simple reason. The Jedi were entirely consumed by the broader war effort against the Separatists, and law enforcement resources across the galaxy had been deprioritized to feed that same war machine. Major Black Sun operations continued throughout the entire conflict with very little meaningful interference from the usual authorities. Toward the end of the Clone Wars, Black Sun's leader at the time made a bold power play, proposing a merger with a rival narcotics-focused syndicate. The leader of that rival organization flatly rejected the merger, a rejection that was not taken well at all. The Black Sun leader retaliated by kidnapping his rival's entire family in an attempt to force a change of heart. His rival refused to be intimidated, and instead hired 2 independent bounty hunters, including a former Sith apprentice, to handle a rescue operation. Together they raided the Black Sun stronghold and successfully recovered the kidnapped family, assaulting the Black Sun leader and his personal guards directly during the operation. Black Sun retaliated in turn by sending a fleet to strike the rival syndicate's own stronghold, a demonstration that the organization's military capabilities were no empty threat. Black Sun, by this point, wasn't merely a loose network of street gangs. It was a force genuinely capable of coordinated fleet operations on a galactic scale. During this same Clone Wars era, a renegade Sith Lord resurfaced and began assembling a criminal coalition of his own, manipulating Black Sun's leadership into joining his effort. When negotiations between that Sith Lord and Black Sun eventually broke down, his forces attacked Black Sun directly, eliminating several of its leaders and forcing the survivors to swear loyalty under threat of further losses. Black Sun, alongside its former narcotics rival, eventually severed all ties with that Sith Lord's coalition entirely. Once it became clear the coalition had been defeated by a separate faction in an unrelated confrontation, the lesson both syndicates took away was a simple one. Financial ruin trumps intimidation over the long run. Once that coalition could no longer pay or protect them, the major underworld players simply walked away from the arrangement. Following the Clone Wars and the subsequent rise of the Galactic Empire, Black Sun adapted quickly to the new economic reality, acquiring specialized sabotage droids and putting them to work in illicit chop shops on the smuggler's moon we've already covered extensively, giving the Syndicate a genuine competitive edge in the new market for stolen vehicles and parts that the Imperial economy inadvertently created throughout the Underworld. During the early days of the Empire, Black Sun was led by a figure whose grip on power was noticeably weak from the very start. There were already ambitious figures rising up through the ranks beneath him, and one of those rising figures, a noble-born Falline crime lord, had climbed steadily through Black Sun's hierarchy across the late Republic and early Imperial eras, leveraging natural cunning and powerful personal connections to navigate the criminal underworld at the very highest levels. Eventually, he would usurp his predecessor's position and take command of the entire syndicate himself. Under his leadership, Black Sun would reach the absolute height of its power and prestige in its entire multi-thousand-year existence, and he would eventually become powerful enough that some observers on Coruscant considered him surpassed in raw galactic influence by only 2 other beings in existence. We'll be returning to his story in considerably more detail later on, because it genuinely deserves its own extended treatment. But here's what matters about Black Sun as a whole. As a piece of underworld history, the Syndicate had proven something no other criminal organization had managed to prove before it. A crime organization born entirely out of opportunistic chaos could survive multiple successive galactic governments back to back. It outlasted the Sith Empire that had indirectly given it life. The Republic that followed never managed to shut it down. Major operations continued straight through the entire Clone Wars. When the Galactic Empire rose to power, Black Sun simply adapted to the new regime and the syndicate persisted into an era well beyond the Empire's eventual fall as well. Black Sun stood as the longest test case the galactic underworld would ever produce for what a criminal syndicate could become if it simply kept showing up, generation after generation, for 3,500 years running. There was one particular commodity in the galaxy that every major crime syndicate absolutely needed reliable access to in order to keep functioning, and a single species had figured out how to control almost the entire supply of it. That species was known as the Pikes, and the commodity in question was spice, the single most valuable narcotic anywhere in known space. The Pikes ended up building one of the most efficient criminal monopolies in the entire history of the galactic underworld around this one product alone. The Pikes were a humanoid species native to a terrestrial world, with genuinely obsidian terrain covering its entire surface, and they were physically distinctive in ways that set them apart from most other humanoid species in the galaxy, generally slimmer and taller than humans, with long, lanky limbs ending in hands that varied between individuals in exactly how many fingers they had. The species actually came in two distinct physiological types, one characterized by oversized craniums sitting atop comparatively small faces, and another with more conventionally humanoid proportions but distinctly fish-like features. Visitors who traveled to their homeworld generally found it both physically and socially unwelcoming in every respect, which suited its purpose as a criminal stronghold perfectly. Nobody arrived there by accident, and nobody stayed unless they were specifically meant to be there. Here's what made the Pikes fundamentally different from every other major syndicate we've covered so far. They came about as close as anyone in galactic history ever managed to a complete monopoly on raw spice production across the entire galaxy. Whoever controlled the spice supply effectively controlled a piece of nearly every other criminal operation that depended on that drug to keep functioning. The actual harvesting didn't happen on the Pike homeworld itself. It happened on a nearby planet with deep spice mines running beneath its surface, mines that supplied essentially the entire galactic market. Those mines were worked by slaves brought there specifically for that purpose, and the conditions were genuinely unsurvivable for most species without serious protective equipment. Even the Pikes themselves, when working the mines directly, had to wear specialized breathing apparatus and lead-lined clothing just to survive the constant radiation exposure. Without that equipment, even members of the species that ran the operation couldn't have functioned down there for very long. To move spice from those mines out to customers across the galaxy, the Pike Syndicate depended entirely on a network of independent smugglers and freighter captains, the only people both willing and skilled enough to handle what became known throughout the galaxy as a notoriously dangerous shipping route, running straight through treacherous nebula formations and gravity wells surrounding the mining world. Only the very best pilots in the entire underworld could reliably complete that run and deliver their cargo intact, and a significant portion of those deliveries ended up on Coruscant, where the most influential crime families on the capital world eagerly awaited each new shipment. The Pike military machine was every bit as serious as its distribution network. Standard infantry carried a mix of sidearms and heavier repeating blasters, while an elite guard force known as the Sentinels carried more specialized weaponry and were responsible for overseeing slave operations directly and intimidating any rival syndicate that dared interfere with Pike business. The syndicate also maintained a substantial fleet of patrol ships and freighters, transporting both enforcers and goods around the underworld on a continuous, ongoing basis, giving the Pikes a complete logistics operation running entirely independent of any other galactic power. Leadership of the Pike Syndicate changed hands across several distinct eras of galactic history. During the Clone Wars, one particular leader held the reins, and later, during the early years of the Galactic Empire, a different leader took over. Both were major players in the galactic spice trade, and would go on to shape the Syndicate's relationships with other major powers throughout their respective tenures. Now here's where the Pike story gets pulled into one of the more significant secret events of the entire prequel era. Around the time of the invasion of Naboo, roughly 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, the sitting Supreme Chancellor of the Republic had a serious problem on his hands. An internal dispute brewing within the Pike Syndicate that threatened to spill over into a full-scale gang war right on Coruscant itself. So he quietly sent a Jedi Master, along with his own personal aide, on a secret diplomatic mission to the Pike homeworld to try to settle the dispute before it could escalate any further. Pike spice operations were considered a significant component of an even larger criminal network dominating the entire galactic narcotics trade, one significant enough that the sitting Chancellor of the Republic was personally trying to manage its internal politics through back channels. He would later explain the situation directly to a senior Jedi Master during the Clone Wars, describing how the Pike's criminal activities allowed them to almost completely control the production of raw spice, used to manufacture one of the galaxy's most powerful drugs. That secret diplomatic mission did not go according to plan. The Chancellor had sent his Jedi envoy to stabilize the brewing Pike Underworld conflict entirely without the knowledge of the Jedi Council. A genuinely desperate move on his part. But shortly after arriving, that Jedi Master and his companion were diverted to an entirely different world by the Jedi High Council before they could finish the assignment, following different orders altogether. What happened next would end up changing galactic history forever. That Jedi Master was ultimately ended on this new world by a Sith Lord operating under a secret identity. A Sith Lord who had been working with the Pikes at the time specifically to conceal his own rule and secretly commissioning the massive clone army the galaxy would eventually march to war with. The Pikes had, in effect, been used as an unwitting smokescreen for one of the single biggest Sith conspiracies in galactic history. Later, during the Clone Wars proper, the Pike Syndicate would prove genuinely valuable to another major Sith figure. The same renegade Sith Lord who had assembled that earlier criminal coalition recruited the Pikes directly into his ranks, and their leader personally joined the effort, proving especially useful during that Sith Lord's takeover of a major Mandalorian capital city. Pike involvement in that particular operation gave the Sith Lord the foothold he needed to control an entire Mandalorian sector for a period of time. Around this same Clone Wars era, the Pikes were involved in another incident that became genuinely famous throughout Underworld circles. A senior Pike representative, acting on behalf of a Hutt-aligned client, negotiated a spice delivery deal with a young smuggler. She agreed to handle the run, loading the cargo onto her sister's freighter, with a former Jedi Padawan traveling incognito along for the ride. The three of them set off with the spice shipment in tow, but the run went badly sideways along the route. A confrontation broke out, and the ship's owner became convinced the Pikes intended to simply seize her vessel once they arrived, so she made a desperate choice in the moment. She dumped the entire spice shipment to deny it to the Pikes outright. That decision saved her ship, but left the sisters with an enormous debt to the syndicate that would follow them for a long time afterward. Pike business kept expanding steadily regardless of individual incidents like this one. During the Clone Wars, the Pikes became the galaxy's preeminent spice dealers, gaining full control of the mining operation and funneling illicit substances continuously to Coruscant's most influential crime families. Their home base remained where it had always been, but they maintained an equally powerful presence at the mines themselves, with elite sentinels keeping close watch over both the enslaved miners extracting the spice and the smugglers hired to ferry it out to off-world purification plants and refineries, making certain nothing was stolen in transit. Even after the Clone Wars ended and the Galactic Empire rose to power, Pike operations continued at full scale across the galaxy. They maintained large-scale mining operations throughout the entire Imperial era, working their slaves under genuinely brutal conditions and maintaining their tight grip on the galactic narcotics supply. The Empire, notably, chose not to interfere with any of this in any meaningful way, since the spice trade kept far too much of the broader galactic economy moving to justify shutting it down. By the later Clone Wars and early Imperial era, the Pike Syndicate was officially counted among the 5 most powerful crime syndicates in the entire galaxy. And here's what made the Pikes essential to every other major criminal player operating anywhere in the galaxy. Total control of the single most lucrative drug on the market made them indispensable partners to nearly every other crime syndicate in existence. You simply couldn't run a serious underworld operation in any sector without eventually doing business with the Pikes in some capacity. That single fact ensured their continued relevance through every major change in galactic government. The Pikes never needed to fight for their position within the underworld. They just needed to keep the mines running. Every crime syndicate we've covered so far needed one specific type of professional to handle their dirtiest, most dangerous work. That professional was the bounty hunter. And in the final centuries of the Old Republic, bounty hunters finally decided to formally organize themselves. The organization they created became known as the Bounty Hunters Guild, formed during the last days of the Old Republic with the explicit purpose of regulating the entire bounty hunting profession across the galaxy. Before the guild existed, bounty hunting had been a genuinely chaotic free-for-all. Hunters routinely stole each other's targets, they interfered with each other's active contracts, They sometimes even eliminated each other over disputes that could have been resolved with a simple conversation. The guild was designed specifically to bring order to all of that. The guild essentially functioned as a professional trade association for hunters across the galaxy. It established formal rules for how bounties could be legitimately claimed. It resolved disputes between hunters pursuing the same target. And it managed how the entire profession interacted with both local planetary authorities and the Republic government itself. For the first time in galactic history, bounty hunters had something resembling genuine professional standards to actually live by. Bounties posted through the guild represented some of the most lucrative work available anywhere in the galactic underworld. The guild regulated a genuinely wide variety of targets, covering criminals on the run from local authorities, common thieves and considerably worse offenders, and even rival hunters who had broken the profession's own established rules. A hunter who crossed the wrong people could quickly find themselves on the receiving end of a guild-sanctioned bounty of their own. Leadership within the guild was actually decided through elections, which made it genuinely unusual compared to most other underworld organizations. Candidates would send out holographic campaign messages to guild members ahead of votes, and the entire system operated more like a legitimate professional association than a typical criminal enterprise. By the time of the Separatist crisis at the end of the Republic era, the guild had a new leader in charge, a Trandoshan who, notably, had made his home on the Smuggler's Moon during the Old Republic period. By the Clone Wars era, he had risen all the way to the top of the entire organization, an aging but still genuinely vicious figure now calling the shots for hunters across the whole galaxy. But the most interesting part of his story is actually his family situation. He had a son, also Trandoshan, also a working bounty hunter, and the rivalry between father and son would come to shape guild politics for years afterward. The son's name in the Trandoshan language roughly translated to something like devours his prey, a name earned, according to tradition, in a genuinely brutal way immediately after hatching. In reality, one of his siblings actually survived that hatching event, but the legend of total sibling consumption became embedded in Trandoshan bounty hunting culture regardless. From his father, the son also learned practical criminal skills early on, along with an inherited long-standing Trandoshan hatred toward Wookiees. By the time he reached maturity, he followed directly in his father's footsteps into the family trade. He would eventually surpass his own father in galactic reputation, creating serious ongoing tension between the two of them. Before the first major battle of the Clone Wars, a Geonosian foreman hired both father and son for a specific job tracking down a list of high-value targets. The hunt took them across several worlds, but they were ultimately beaten to the prize by a different hunter entirely, a Mandalorian who delivered the targets alive to a Sith Lord operating under a secret identity, who specifically wanted them captured alive for his own purposes. The whole incident publicly established that particular Mandalorian's superiority over the regular guild membership in a single embarrassing moment for guild leadership. When a Jedi once accidentally eliminated a licensed guild hunter while both were independently pursuing the same target, the guild's leader issued a stern formal rebuke directly to the Jedi Order itself, declaring that the death of a licensed hunter was simply unacceptable. That message sent a clear signal across the galaxy. The guild considered itself a genuine institution now, and expected to be respected accordingly, even by the Jedi. That same Mandalorian hunter, notably, never actually joined the guild despite repeated recruitment attempts by its leader. He explained his refusal to his own clone son in fairly personal terms, saying simply that he didn't care for organized groups, dismissing them as little more than self-congratulating social clubs. He preferred working entirely alone, and that independence became a defining trait his son would inherit from him in turn. The guild's formal code dictated specific professional standards for any hunter operating under its banner. The basic rules were straightforward: no eliminating fellow hunters, no stealing bounties someone else had already claimed, and certain broader rules of honor meant to separate genuine professionals from common thugs. The code was designed to keep the entire profession respectable, even when the actual work itself was frequently ugly. Several of the era's most famous bounty hunters operated largely outside the guild's full embrace, valuing personal independence above any sense of professional camaraderie. This list included that same independent Mandalorian along with two other major names. One was a Duros bounty hunter, who would become one of the most infamous hunters of the entire Clone Wars era, known across the galaxy for his cold, methodical approach and his distinctive wide-brimmed hat. The other was a former Jedi Padawan turned ruthless bounty hunter, particularly notorious for hunting Jedi during the Clone Wars, who also took on personal mentorship of a young hunter who would go on to even greater fame later. The Trandoshan species as a whole had a particularly strong connection to bounty hunting, effectively dominating the guild for decades through the father-son pair we just covered. The son eventually became known as the pilot of a genuinely famous ship and held a formal noble title in addition to his hunting career. By the Imperial era, he would become one of the single most recognized bounty hunters in the entire galaxy. The guild operated openly throughout the Republic era, maintaining offices on multiple worlds and clear working connections to Republic law enforcement, making it a strange kind of legal criminal hybrid organization. Its members were doing work that constantly straddled the line between the legal and criminal worlds. After the rise of the Galactic Empire, the guild itself actually survived the transition intact. Its aging leader continued running the organization, which formally became an allied holding of the new imperial regime. According to imperial documentation from the period, the reasoning behind this arrangement was straightforward. Bounty hunters generally believed the highest bidder simply makes the rules, and as long as the empire was paying well, the guild was entirely willing to serve. That relationship came with real tangible benefits for both sides. The guild was permitted to issue imperial peacekeeping certificates to its hunters, granting them access to imperial enforcement data, a genuine treasure trove of targeting intelligence. For any working hunter, that data access alone made the Imperial Alliance well worth maintaining. Several famous hunters remained guild members throughout the Imperial era, taking contracts directly from the Empire, though one particular hunter's commitment to the guild was always thin at best, having inherited his own father's distaste for formal organizations and frequently acting on his own terms, regardless of what guild leadership expected. Rebel intelligence eventually noticed the guild's growing entanglement with Imperial operations during this period, with one rebel agent reporting to his superiors that sentiment was trending increasingly negative toward the rebellion as the Empire leaned more heavily on guild services, and that the guild's leader was making an absolute fortune off the arrangement, one that was actively damaging the rebellion's broader reputation across the galaxy. The bounty hunter's code was strictly enforced whenever it was actually followed at all. Bounties were considered sacred under this code. Professional standards genuinely mattered to any hunter who wanted to keep working long-term. Betraying or eliminating a fellow hunter could result in permanent blacklisting from the entire profession, but the code wasn't always honored in practice. Some hunters routinely acted independently, violating guild rules whenever it suited their own interests. The code was strongest whenever guild leadership itself was strong, and it weakened right alongside any weakening in that leadership. The code, the guild, and the loose freelance network surrounding both shaped the professional galactic underworld for generations. The guild provided exactly the kind of structure organized crime needed to function smoothly alongside corporate and HUT aligned interests in a genuinely coordinated way. Without the guild and its code, bounty hunting would likely have remained a chaotic free-for-all indefinitely. With them, it became one of the most reliable, dependable services in the entire criminal economy. By the time of the Clone Wars and beyond, the Bounty Hunters Guild stood as a firmly entrenched institution within the galactic underworld, a stable piece of criminal infrastructure that had already survived the rise and fall of multiple galactic governments. And here's the genuinely ironic part of how the Guild's story would eventually end. The institution wasn't brought down by the Republic. It wasn't brought down by the Empire. It wasn't brought down by the Jedi Order. And it wasn't brought down by any rival syndicate either. It was eventually dismantled by one of its own most famous members, someone whose story would go on to become one of the single most defining narratives in the later history of the entire galactic underworld. If you've stuck around this long, we're genuinely grateful, and if you want more of this exact kind of long-form deep dive to fall asleep to or work alongside, subscribing really does help this channel keep making them. This next part is the story of how one of the most famous bounty hunters in the entire galaxy first picked up a weapon. And the whole arc begins on a quiet farm with a young boy who had absolutely no idea what was about to happen to his family. We already touched on how Mandalorian culture fractured roughly 60 years before the Battle of Yavin. The reforming faction, known as the True Mandalorians, supported their new leader's push toward becoming honorable mercenaries. The traditionalist faction that opposed him became known as Death Watch. Let's pick that thread back up. The leader of the True Mandalorians had been born on an agricultural world and had risen steadily through Mandalorian ranks over many years to eventually become Mandalore of his entire people. He had a genuinely clear vision for his culture's future, insisting that any Mandalorian who still wanted to fight should act as a highly paid soldier and conduct themselves as an honorable mercenary, restraining the worst excesses of warrior culture without abandoning the warrior identity itself entirely. These reforms had actually been quietly demanded by Mandalorians themselves for generations, ever since an earlier conflict had nearly wiped out an entire alien species, and large portions of Mandalorian society had wanted to step away from wholesale slaughter as a standard way of doing business ever since. He was simply the leader who finally acted on what so many had been quietly asking for. But not every Mandalorian agreed with this new direction. Many warriors believed the old conquering tradition should continue completely undiluted, exactly as it had been practiced for thousands of years, and this opposition was led by a particularly dangerous figure who represented the most brutal possible reaction to these reforms. He wanted a full return to savagery. He wanted to reignite a galaxy-spanning war of conquest. He viewed the new reform code as a fundamental betrayal of authentic Mandalorian identity. His followers were skilled warriors, but they were also considerably less disciplined than the true Mandalorians, and they rallied around him under a new name entirely, Death Watch. Their entire stated purpose was overthrowing the reforms by any means necessary. The reformist warriors who remained loyal to the new Mandalore rebranded themselves as the true Mandalorians. The split between these two factions became the central schism of late Mandalorian history, and it's worth noting that a separate, more genuinely pacifist faction would also eventually emerge, meaning Death Watch would find itself opposed on two fronts simultaneously. Unable to find common ground with either the true Mandalorians or these later pacifists, three factions locked in an uneasy standoff that would shape the galactic underworld for decades to come. Now we arrive at the day everything changed. Death Watch had been tracking the true Mandalorians for some time, and they eventually caught up with their enemies at a farmstead that belonged to a family sheltering Mariel's troops. It was an ordinary day. The harvest was underway. Nobody expected any violence at all. A young boy was out working on his family's harvester when Death Watch soldiers arrived. His name was Jango Fett, and at that moment he was simply a kid doing ordinary farm chores. The soldiers took him captive immediately, demanding he lead them back to his family's actual home, where his father was secretly harboring Mariel's troops. Jango had no real choice in the matter. He led them there. What happened at the house would shape him for the rest of his life. The Death Watch leader personally beat Jango's father in front of his son, demanding to know where the hidden Mandalorians were, threatening to execute him on the spot. That's when Jango's mother intervened, picking up a blaster rifle and taking down one of the attacking soldiers herself. The entire situation immediately dissolved into chaos. In the middle of the confusion, Jango's father gave his son one final instruction: run into the crop field and disappear. Jango ran. The true Mandalorians happened to be nearby. As Jango fled into the fields, the Mandalore and his soldiers swept into the farmstead from another direction entirely, engaging Death Watch directly. Jango himself was rescued in those final chaotic moments, but the rescue came too late for the rest of his family. Both of his parents were taken from him during the fighting, and his sister was captured alive and dragged away by the retreating Death Watch forces. As Jango and the surviving true Mandalorians escaped into the fields, the Death Watch leader gave one final vicious order: burn the crops to the ground, hoping the fleeing Mandalorians would be caught in the resulting flames. The fire spread fast, but the true Mandalorians knew the terrain far better than their pursuers did, and they made it out alive on the other side. Death Watch then made the mistake that would ultimately cost them everything that day. Believing they had already won the engagement, they moved into a nearby town to celebrate, planning an additional raid purely for entertainment before continuing their broader campaign. They let their guard down completely for the first time all day, and that's precisely when the true Mandalorians ambushed them in the town itself. The strike caught Death Watch entirely off guard. Nearly every Death Watch soldier present in that town fell to blaster fire, or was lost when their own armored vehicle was destroyed in the chaos of the ambush. And Jango Fett, the boy who had been forced to lead these same soldiers to his own family's home just hours earlier that morning, personally took down the specific Death Watch soldier responsible for what had happened to his parents. The kid had become a fighter in the span of a single day, but the Death Watch leader himself managed to slip out of the ambush and escape with his life intact, disappearing underground to quietly rebuild his forces in the shadows. Jango Fett, his family gone and his sister still missing, made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He joined the true Mandalorians as a child soldier, and their leader formally adopted him as his own son. The boy from the farm now had a new father, a new family, and a genuine new purpose. Django would serve as a squad commander under this new father figure for the next several years, training constantly, learning the Mandalorian way of both fighting and living. He was, in every meaningful sense, being deliberately shaped into the next generation of true Mandalorian leadership. Roughly 6 years after the events on that farm, by approximately 52 years before the Battle of Yavin, the true Mandalorian leader had every reason to believe Death Watch had finally been crushed as a serious threat. There had been no significant activity from his old enemy in years, and intelligence reports suggested the Splinter faction had simply collapsed entirely. With Death Watch apparently gone for good, he turned his full attention back to mercenary contracts as the true Mandalorian's primary line of work going forward. It was in this exact capacity that the true Mandalorians traveled to a planet under contract from a local defense force, hired for what looked like a routine job, extracting a rookie security team pinned down under fire. Intelligence suggested the local resistance was minimal, with no formal army and only poor weapons available to them. That intelligence was completely wrong. The entire operation was a setup. Death Watch had been lying in wait the entire time, having spent the past 6 years quietly rebuilding in secret, patiently waiting for exactly the right moment to strike back. When the true Mandalorians landed, the trap was sprung immediately. The Mandalore and his second-in-command came under direct fire from the Death Watch leader himself, who still carried visible scars from their previous encounter on that farm years earlier, and who had clearly been waiting a very long time for this exact moment. He rained down attacks from an armored vehicle onto the Mandalore's second-in-command and the already injured Mandalore below. And then that second-in-command did something nobody expected. He fled the engagement entirely, abandoning his own leader in the middle of the fight. The Mandalore was finished off by his oldest enemy, betrayed at the moment of his greatest need by his own most trusted subordinate. But Jango Fett was not going down alongside his adoptive father. Now a fully trained Mandalorian warrior in his own right, he fought back against dozens of Death Watch soldiers alongside whatever surviving true Mandalorians remained under his command. The teenage boy who had once run through a crop field on that farm was now a hardened soldier, holding the line against the exact same enemy that had already taken his original family away from him. Jango personally carried his adoptive father's body back to their extraction point once the fighting ended, and once they were safely away, the traitorous second-in-command was exposed for exactly what he'd done. The surviving true Mandalorians wanted answers, and Jango Fett provided them. As the senior surviving commander on the scene, Jango succeeded his adoptive father directly, taking the title of Mandalore for himself at a remarkably young age. The traitor was exiled from the Mandalorians entirely, going on to become a brutal independent bounty hunter in the years that followed, a path that would eventually cross with Jango's own story again, with its own brutal conclusion later on. Jango Fett, now Mandalore of the true Mandalorians, would lead his people for the next several years. His agenda had 2 clear parts: keep accepting the mercenary contracts that paid his people's bills, and hunt down Death Watch across the entire galaxy, hoping to finally settle the score that had begun on that quiet farm all those years earlier. The Mandalorian Civil War had produced its next generation of warriors, and young Jango Fett was about to become one of the most legendary figures in the entire galactic underworld. That old Death Watch enemy had spent years quietly planning the perfect setup to finish off the true Mandalorians once and for all, and roughly 44 years before the Battle of Yavin, he finally pulled it off. The trap he built that year would end an entire faction, redirect the future course of the Jedi Order, and split Jango Fett's life permanently into 2 completely separate halves. By this point in galactic history, Jango Fett was Mandalore of the true Mandalorians, leading his people as a mercenary force while continuing to hunt Death Watch on the side whenever opportunity allowed. A new contract arrived that looked entirely routine on the surface. A planetary governor dealing with an insurrection among his own colonists needed a professional mercenary outfit to handle the situation, and he hired the true Mandalorians under Jango's direct command. Jango accepted, and his forces put down the insurrection with the kind of brutal efficiency professional mercenaries were expected to deliver. What Jango didn't know at the time was that this governor had something else entirely going on behind the scenes. He was secretly harboring Death Watch operatives inside his own estate, personally advised by the old Death Watch leader on exactly how to construct the perfect trap. The entire contract had been a Death Watch operation from the very beginning. The insurrection itself was real enough, but the larger scheme was unfolding underneath it the whole time. After the rebels were defeated, Jango went to the governor's estate to collect payment, and while there, He also intended to press the governor about Death Watch's whereabouts directly, having picked up on signals suggesting some kind of connection. He wanted answers, and he was prepared to apply real pressure to get them. The confrontation played out in a single explosive moment. The Death Watch leader revealed himself directly, having been hiding inside the estate the entire time. Waiting in ambush with a full cadre of soldiers at his side, he attacked Django on sight, forcing the Mandalore to flee through a large window in a desperate bid to escape. He took a well-aimed shot at Django's jetpack during the retreat, sending him crashing to the ground outside. But the bigger play was already in motion elsewhere. The governor had contacted the Jedi Council with a false plea for help before the true Mandalorians had even arrived on the planet, carefully crafting a story designed to hit every emotional pressure point the Order had, claiming the Mandalorians were slaughtering political activists alongside innocent women and children, and that the Republic itself couldn't intervene in time. When the governor privately expressed concern to the Death Watch leader about the total lack of physical evidence for these supposed atrocities, he was assured that Death Watch soldiers would happily supply the necessary body count themselves. Those soldiers proceeded to eliminate actual civilians on the planet, and staged the scene specifically to frame the true Mandalorians for the entire massacre. By the time the Jedi arrived, there would be more than enough manufactured evidence to convict the Mandalorians of exactly the kind of war crimes the governor had reported. The Jedi Council took the governor's account at face value, without conducting any real independent investigation, dispatching a strike team led by a respected Jedi Master and his Padawan, a young woman who would go on to have her own significant history in the Underworld later. This Jedi Master's task force was backed by full Republic judicial forces and included multiple additional Jedi Knights, representing a genuinely serious commitment of resources to what the Council believed was a straightforward humanitarian intervention. When this Jedi force confronted the true Mandalorians, the Master delivered a direct ultimatum: surrender immediately, and you'll be treated fairly. His Padawan added her own line right afterward, one that sounded considerably less like a peaceful resolution, and much more like a direct threat of overwhelming force. Jango Fett saw exactly what was happening. He understood Death Watch had engineered the entire situation, understood the Jedi were operating on completely false intelligence, and he was not willing to surrender to that kind of obvious injustice. So he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He ordered his troops to open fire. The engagement went badly from almost the first moment. Blaster fire proved essentially useless against trained Jedi, with lightsabers deflecting shots right back at the shooters, so Jango adapted quickly, switching to projectile weapons and calling in jetpack-equipped air support instead. But the battle was already slipping away. His own second-in-command attempted to provide air cover and was cut down mid-flight by one of the Jedi, while Jango could only watch helplessly from below, a devastating loss that pushed him into a state of cold, focused fury. The Padawan proved to be the single most dangerous Jedi on that field, cutting down Mandalorian after Mandalorian in a force-augmented assault that accounted for at least 20 warriors on her own, operating well beyond anything resembling standard Jedi protocol. Jango went straight for the Jedi who had killed his second-in-command, closing the distance and finishing him with his bare hands after a brutal, close-quarters struggle. And then he kept going. Over the course of the rest of the engagement, Jango personally took down 6 separate Jedi using nothing but his own hands, feet, and armored body, with no traditional weapon at all, achieving something no non-Force user had ever managed against trained Jedi before. But none of Jango's individual feats could turn the tide of the larger battle. The Jedi Force was simply too strong, and the Padawan's rampage was tearing through the true Mandalorians faster than they could regroup. When the dust finally settled, 11 Jedi lay defeated on that field, but every single true Mandalorian present had fallen except for Jango himself and one other surviving warrior. An entire faction, painstakingly rebuilt over years, had been wiped out in a single afternoon. Jango, now the last true Mandalorian fighter standing, lost the will to keep fighting once he realized his people were gone, and he was captured without further resistance. The casualties on both sides had been genuinely catastrophic. The Jedi Master later admitted more than half his own force had fallen during the engagement, along with the majority of the accompanying judicial reinforcements. What had looked like an easy operation on paper turned into one of the worst Jedi losses in years, and it was only after the fighting stopped that the surviving Jedi realized what had actually happened. They had been used as an unwitting tool in Death Watch's larger scheme. and the Jedi Council had failed to properly investigate the original report before sending its people directly into an ambush. This entire disaster would become one of the seeds of that same Jedi Master's later disillusionment with the Order itself, planting ideological roots that would eventually contribute to his own fall to the dark side much later in galactic history. The Jedi were eventually forced to hand Jango over to the planetary governor, who took his armor as a personal trophy and sold him onto a spice transport, where Jango spent the following years working under forced labor for criminals he had no real way to fight back against. He didn't stay captive forever. During a pirate raid on that transport, he saw his opening, escaped in the resulting chaos, eliminated everyone aboard who tried to stop him, and made his way directly back to settle his unfinished business. He eventually caught up with the Death Watch leader on a different planet entirely, delivering the conclusion he had been waiting years to provide, leaving his old enemy to be finished off by local wildlife after a decisive final confrontation. With that leader gone, the remaining Death Watch members went deep underground, surviving as an organization but as a far smaller and considerably weaker faction than they had ever been before, wary of provoking Jango's wrath a second time. Jango retained the title of Mandalore after this, but he effectively stopped functioning as a real leader in any meaningful sense. Since there were essentially no true Mandalorians left for him to actually lead, he became a bounty hunter instead. But he had earned something else along the way, a genuinely legendary reputation across the galactic underworld, one that would soon attract attention from figures with far darker plans for him, and the choices Jango Fett made next would go on to shape the entire course of the Clone Wars that followed. Every crime syndicate in the galaxy eventually produced one single figure, whose name grew bigger than the syndicate itself. For the Hutt cartel, that figure was Jabba, and his throne room on a remote desert world became the single most famous criminal headquarters in the entire history of the galactic underworld. His full formal title carried more genuine weight than most people realized, marking him as a member of a specific powerful Hutt clan, holding official residence on the Hutt homeworld while personally claiming an entire desert planet as his own territory, even though that world had never technically, legally belonged to any Hutt clan at all. Jabba was born roughly 600 years before the events of the original rebellion against the Empire, meaning he was somewhere around 600 years old by the time of his final confrontation with that same rebellion. Hutts were generally an extremely long-lived species, but Jabba had managed to extend his personal influence far beyond what most members of his own clan ever achieved. He was a gangster and a crime lord, but also a genuinely influential member of the broader Hutt governing council, sitting at the very top table of Hutt politics as one of the most recognized faces in the entire cartel. At the remarkably young age of just 80, considered genuinely young by Hutt standards, Jabba made the move that would define the rest of his life, departing the wider Hutt establishment to set up his own independent criminal operation on that remote desert world. He converted an old monastery building into his personal palace, a structure that would eventually become the most famous criminal headquarters anywhere in the galactic underworld. Jabba ran his illicit operations out of this desert palace centuries before the Clone Wars ever broke out, gradually spreading his influence across the entire Outer Rim through a constant network of smugglers moving his goods across the galaxy daily. His criminal empire eventually grew to encompass several specialties simultaneously: spice smuggling, gun-running operations supplying conflicts across multiple systems, captive labor networks, and piracy against shipping throughout the surrounding sectors. That desert world itself became Jabba's personal kingdom over the following centuries. He controlled the bulk of local piracy, the movement of captive labor, and the flow of illegal goods, meaning almost everything that generated real wealth on that planet passed through one of Jabba's operations at some point. He had effectively become the unofficial ruler of an entire world, without ever needing to claim any formal governing title. His reach extended well beyond that single world too. He was highly influential across the entire Outer Rim as one of its single most powerful crime lords, maintaining hundreds of bounty hunters, smugglers, and assassins on his personal payroll at any given time. Anyone needing dirty work handled in the Outer Rim eventually had to deal with someone inside Jabba's network sooner or later. His family situation was genuinely complicated even by Hutt standards, with an extended web of relatives all deeply involved in Hutt clan politics, each running their own piece of the broader family empire. Jabba had his own clan insignia tattooed onto his arm, the same kind of symbol of identity and lineage we mentioned earlier when covering the broader Hutt cartel system. a permanent mark of his deep pride in an ancestral line stretching all the way back to the original clans that survived the cataclysm thousands of years earlier. His personality was, in many ways, a textbook example of the typical Hutt crime lord scaled up to genuinely galactic notoriety. He was greedy at every available opportunity, malicious toward his enemies, pragmatic in business decisions, prideful in ways that demanded constant displays of his own power, and skilled at bending other beings to his will through a mixture of manipulation, threats, and reward. His throne room physically reflected every one of these traits. He collected trophies and trinkets as constant visible reminders of his own power, the most famous of which was the carbonite frozen body of a captured smuggler, hung directly on the wall of his throne room as both a piece of decoration and a public warning to anyone who might consider crossing him. He also had an unsettling personal preference for young female humanoids, frequently forcing them into roles as dancers or companions within his court, a pattern that defined some of his worst qualities as a ruler and would eventually contribute directly to his own downfall. His position within the wider Hutt power structure was consistently tense. He maintained an uneasy alliance with a rival Hutt from a competing clan, the two of them starting out as business partners before gradually becoming serious, ongoing rivals, competing for control over broader Hutt territory throughout Jabba's entire career, a feud that ran through his entire life as one of its defining conflicts. During the Clone Wars, both major sides of the conflict actively sought Jabba's cooperation over control of key Outer Rim hyperlanes, since both understood that whoever controlled Hutt trade routes held a massive logistical advantage in the wider war. The situation got personal for Jabba very quickly when his infant son was abducted, in a plot orchestrated by his own uncle working alongside the Separatist alliance, specifically designed to manipulate Jabba into siding with the Separatists by framing the Republic for the kidnapping. Jabba requested help from anyone capable of finding and recovering his son, and the Republic and Jedi Order answered directly, dispatching a young Jedi Knight and his Padawan to track the infant down and successfully return him home. Following that rescue, the entire Hutt cartel became an official Republic ally, granting the Grand Army safe passage through Hutt space, a major strategic advantage secured entirely because two Jedi had saved a kidnapped baby. The most famous bounty plot of Jabba's entire career started with a single incident involving lost cargo near that same treacherous nebula region we've mentioned a few times now, when a young smuggler dropped an entire shipment of valuable spice during an Imperial patrol encounter. Jabba, furious over the financial loss, placed a substantial bounty on that smuggler's head. A bounty that would eventually drive an entire chase plot spanning years and culminating in a carbonite freezing and a final decisive confrontation on Jabba's own home turf. By the dawn of the rebellion against the Empire, Jabba had become the single most powerful crime lord in the entire Outer Rim, with some observers believing he might genuinely be the most powerful crime lord in the whole galaxy. His success rested largely on a near total monopoly over one particular refined spice product. The Pike Syndicate we covered earlier supplied most of the raw material, and Jabba had become the dominant distributor of the finished product across multiple sectors. At his absolute peak, his home clan had become the single largest and most powerful of all Hutt clans, having finally surpassed its longtime rival in a major reversal of fortune that had been building for decades. During the Empire's reign, Jabba maintained an uneasy but functional alliance with the Imperial regime, which cautiously chose not to interfere too heavily with his operations, largely because the Hutts simply paid handsomely to be left alone, with an extensive bribery network keeping Imperial officers from looking too closely at what was actually happening in Hutt-controlled territory. Even at the height of his power, though, Jabba dealt with recurring problems behind the scenes, and even his closest lieutenants had begun quietly plotting his eventual removal, meaning he could trust almost nobody within his own palace operation completely. Only two people held his genuine, unreserved trust: his personal accountant and the non-Hutt he'd made chief of security over his entire palace. Jabba also maintained business dealings with the Black Sun crime lord we mentioned earlier, addressing him in the shared galactic trade language during their conversations, a genuinely rare concession for a Hutt to make, since Hutts typically insisted on conducting all conversations in their own native tongue as a matter of cultural pride. That single detail tells you exactly how seriously Jabba took those particular negotiations. The rivalry between Jabba's clan and its longtime competitor reached one of its bloodiest peaks when the rival clan's leader was poisoned by Jabba and one of his own relatives. After that leader fell, his son became a protected lieutenant under the very same Black Sun crime lord Jabba had been dealing with, meaning the old Hutt feud had now spilled directly into Black Sun's internal politics, intertwining the two major underworld powers in a way that would carry significant consequences down the line. Jabba's own ending came roughly 4 years after the Battle of Yavin, during the height of the Rebellion era. A captured princess, forced into his throne room as a prisoner, took advantage of an opening during a rescue operation and used the very chain Jabba had used to bind her to finish him personally in the resulting chaos. The single most powerful crime lord in the Outer Rim had been taken down by a prisoner he had badly underestimated. Jabba's removal created an enormous power vacuum across the entire Outer Rim almost immediately. Two small-time criminals attempted to seize control of his most significant smuggling operation, sparking an immediate gang war as other ambitious figures scrambled to grab their own piece of what Jabba had left behind. The wider Outer Rim underworld had lost its central organizing figure with absolutely no clear successor in place. And many Hutts looking back on the era would later come to believe that if Jabba had still been alive in the years that followed, the Hutt cartel might well have avoided some of its very worst disasters down the road. Jabba's removal had, in a very real sense, directly precipitated the long-term decline of the entire Hutt cartel. The species had lost more than just one crime lord that day. They had lost the steady hand that had kept their whole cartel functioning at the top of the galactic underworld for centuries. When Jango Fett fell during the opening battle of the Clone Wars, the title of top bounty hunter in the galaxy was suddenly up for grabs. The person who claimed that title within a matter of months would go on to walk directly into the heart of the Galactic Senate itself and take hostages right in front of the Supreme Chancellor. His name was Cad Bane, a Duros male whose career would ultimately span 3 complete galactic eras. He worked through the final years of the Galactic Republic, continued operating straight through the reign of the Galactic Empire, and his name kept turning up in records well into the era of the New Republic that followed. Very few bounty hunters in galactic history ever managed that kind of professional longevity. Before he became Cad Bane, he was simply a street kid on his Duros homeworld, scraping together any way to survive. Eventually getting drawn into criminal activity through a local gangster who gave him his first genuine exposure to professional crime. That gangster eventually fell during his own criminal career, and the experience transformed the young man into the figure we now know. He grew into real infamy after eliminating both a local marshal and his own former friend. An act framed publicly as revenge for what had happened to his old gang, but which also marked the exact moment he left his old identity behind for good, becoming Cad Bane Bounty Hunter from that point forward. His professional reputation rested on 3 specific qualities. He was cold under pressure, methodical in his planning, and genuinely ruthless whenever a contract called for it. He worked strictly for credits, and would turn on his own allies without hesitation if the math favored it. He didn't get along well with other bounty hunters as a rule, and he never once hesitated to eliminate innocent bystanders who happened to get in the way of a job. That last trait earned him a particular kind of reputation across the underworld. He was widely considered the single most dangerous gunman in the entire galaxy following Jango Fett's fall at that earlier battle. 2 specific jobs from the Clone Wars era cemented that reputation for good. The first came directly from the Sith Master pulling strings from the shadows, who approached Bane early in the war with an assignment nobody in the galaxy had ever successfully pulled off before, infiltrating the holocron vault deep inside the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. That vault held extremely sensitive Jedi artifacts, and getting inside would require breaking into the single most heavily fortified building on the entire capital planet. Bane was initially hesitant, understanding just how catastrophic the risks were for any non-Force user, but the Sith Master knew exactly which button to push, casually implying that Bane's reputation might have been somewhat exaggerated. That single insult was enough to secure Bane's agreement immediately. He was given a detailed map of the temple along with a security data chip, which he installed directly into his loyal droid companion, secretly planting an explosive charge inside that same droid as insurance, in case it was ever captured and interrogated. For the actual operation, Bane subcontracted a shape-shifting Claudite accomplice to pose as a deceased Jedi from the inside, giving him an infiltrator who could move freely through the temple's corridors. The plan was thorough, professional, and exactly the kind of layered operation Bane had built his entire reputation on. Bane and his accomplice successfully infiltrated the temple and stole the targeted holocron, an artifact containing one of the most sensitive pieces of information the Jedi Order had ever assembled. the names and locations of Force-sensitive children scattered across the entire galaxy. With that data in hand, Bane went on to use it to abduct several of those children on behalf of the Sith, part of a much longer-term plan to build out Sith infrastructure for the future. Most of the galaxy never learned what had actually happened to those children. Despite having two of the most accomplished Jedi in the entire Order assigned specifically to track him down, Bane successfully evaded both of them and escaped the planet entirely, an outcome that firmly confirmed his place at the very top of the bounty hunting profession. His second major job came shortly afterward, and it was even larger in scope. This contract came directly from Jabba the Hutt, who needed Bane to free his imprisoned uncle from Republic custody. That uncle had been arrested for conspiring with the Separatists, but his arrest had created a much bigger problem for the wider Hutt Council. He was holding a holographic diary documenting years of the Council's own wrongdoing. If he decided to trade that diary to the Senate in exchange for leniency, the contents would expose nearly every major Hutt operation across the galaxy. The Hutt Council was deeply alarmed by this possibility and needed him either freed or silenced before he could cut that kind of deal. Bane took the job and immediately began planning, starting with obtaining blueprints to the Galactic Senate building itself. He initially targeted a particular senator's protocol droid for that data, and when that droid didn't actually have the schematics, he captured her astromech droid instead and extracted the building plans directly from it, carefully returning both droids afterward with their memories wiped, ensuring the Republic had no idea a heist was even being planned. Once he had the schematics in hand, Bane traveled to Jabba's palace, collected payment in person, and received the green light to proceed with the full rescue operation. For the Senate job itself, Bane assembled a specialized team, each member bringing a distinct skill set the operation required. The Jedi hunting bounty hunter we mentioned earlier for direct combat capability, a skilled slicer for technical infiltration work, a weak-way bounty hunter for additional combat support, and an assassin droid for tactical assistance. Together, this four-person crew formed one of the single most dangerous strike teams ever assembled anywhere in the Underworld. Bane and his team infiltrated the Senate building during a quiet evening shift, walking directly up to a group of senators inside the building's corridors, as though he belonged there entirely. When one senator recognized Bane and attempted to walk away, Bane took him down on the spot, a deliberate, calculated show of force meant to establish total dominance over everyone else watching in that room. He then contacted the Supreme Chancellor directly through the building's own communication system, demanding an immediate pardon to free Jabba's uncle from Republic custody, holding the assembled senators hostage until that pardon was actually delivered. To raise the stakes even further, Bane spent the negotiation quietly wiring the entire building with explosives. The Chancellor genuinely had no real choice in the matter, sending a senator alongside a bounty hunter to retrieve the prisoner exactly as demanded. A scenario that would have been utterly unimaginable for the Republic just months earlier, releasing a major criminal at gunpoint inside its own Capitol building. In the middle of the operation, Bane's team managed to capture a young Jedi Knight who happened to be visiting the Senate that evening without his lightsaber, having given the weapon to a companion for safekeeping just hours earlier. He tried to fight back regardless, managing to subdue one of Bane's team members in hand-to-hand combat, but was ultimately disarmed and contained alongside the other hostage senators, with no weapon left to defend himself. Just as Bane was preparing his getaway with the prisoner and the pardon in hand, he found himself confronted by a clone commander and his detachment of the Coruscant Guard, called in by the Chancellor in a last, desperate attempt to stop the entire operation. Bane's response was pure, characteristic ruthlessness. He revealed that the explosives were set to detonate remotely, on his command with all the hostages still inside. Faced with that ultimatum, the Chancellor had no real choice but to let Bane's team escape with the prisoner and the pardon fully intact. Upon actually leaving the building, Bane detonated the explosives anyway, with no tactical justification whatsoever, since his escape was already secured. It was pure malice, and a chilling early preview of the cruelty he would continue displaying in operations to come. A group of Jedi gave chase as Bane's team tried to flee Coruscant, eventually driving the pursuit down toward one of the Underworld's ventilation portals, which gave Bane an idea. He shot out the engine of a passing transport ship to create a distraction, sending the out-of-control vessel crashing into the side of that portal. On the other side lived a family who sacrificed themselves so their two young daughters could escape the impact. Daughters whose entire subsequent path through the Underworld, including that disastrous spice run for the Pike Syndicate we covered earlier, began at this exact moment of trauma, during Cad Bane's escape from the Senate. That diversion let Bane, his hostage, and the rest of his team evade capture entirely, disappearing into the Coruscant underworld before making their way directly to the Hutt homeworld to deliver Jabba's uncle back to his family. His troubles didn't end there, though. Once safely home, he tried to avoid Hutt Council punishment by threatening to release the contents of his diary regardless. And the Council responded by imprisoning him within their own palace facilities, rather than treating him as a free Hutt. He was eventually freed by a lover with her own complicated history among the Hutt clans, and after his escape, he traveled to recover the actual diary from where he'd hidden it years earlier, only to be eliminated at the gravesite by that same lover, who had secretly been working for Jabba on a private contract of her own, delivering the diary records back to Jabba personally. The threat to the Hutt Council was neutralized in the only way the Hutts fully trusted, by their own hands quietly from the inside. The Senate hostage crisis demonstrated something genuinely terrifying to the wider galaxy. Bounty hunters and the Hutt cartel together had proven they could strike directly at the very heart of the Republic itself, take the Supreme Chancellor and his senators hostage inside their own Capitol building, and walk away alive with their target freed, all in the middle of an active galactic war, while the Republic's full attention was supposedly fixed entirely on the Separatist threat. The galactic underworld had just proven that no government building anywhere, no matter how heavily protected, was actually safe from a properly organized criminal operation. Cad Bane had become the living face of that proof, and the entire galaxy now knew exactly what his silhouette looked like. For more than 10 years, a mother on a remote world held on to something the rest of the galaxy refused to believe, that her son, cut clean in half by a Jedi during one of the most public confrontations in modern Sith history, was somehow still alive out there somewhere. That mother was Mother Talzin, a powerful Night Sister, and one of the most respected figures on her homeworld. Her son was Darth Maul, a Force-sensitive Zabrak, who had once served as the very first apprentice to the Sith Master orchestrating events from Coruscant. That Sith Master had taken Maul from his mother as a child, separated him from his brothers, and shaped him into a perfect weapon of the dark side. The galaxy had only witnessed what that weapon could really do once, publicly. During the invasion of Naboo, roughly 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, when Maul faced a Jedi Master and his young Padawan inside a reactor complex, critically wounding the Master before the Padawan caught him off guard with a lightsaber strike that cut him clean in half at the waist. His body fell down a deep shaft and vanished from galactic records entirely. Every official account agreed the Sith apprentice had been finished in one of the cleanest Jedi victories of the era. Mother Talzin never accepted that conclusion. Here's what had actually happened to her son during all those years. His hatred for the Jedi who had defeated him ran so deep that the dark side of the Force kept him alive on pure rage alone. His broken body eventually landed in a pile of discarded waste material, which was shipped off-world along with the rest of that planet's refuse, carrying him to a world that functioned as the galaxy's central junkyard, a place literally named for being lesser, forgotten, unimportant. For the next decade or more, Maul survived there in a state barely resembling actual consciousness. His memories eroded away year after year, and he constructed crude spider-like mechanical legs from scavenged scrap to replace his missing lower half, scuttling through the trash like something out of a nightmare. The only memory he retained with any real clarity was his hatred for the Jedi who had defeated him. A small snake-like opportunist eventually took up residence near his lair, exploiting his broken state by luring unsuspecting scavengers into his territory to be fed upon, keeping both creatures alive for years, while the galaxy had no idea any of this was even happening. Roughly 20 years before the Battle of Yavin, during the height of the Clone Wars, Mother Talzin's certainty finally turned into real action. She dispatched her surviving son to find his lost brother at last, giving him a Night Sister artifact attuned to family blood bonds that would glow whenever he came near a relative of his own blood. Following a trail of shipping containers back to that junkyard world, he eventually found the right cave, confronted his own brother in the dark, and slowly helped him remember who he actually was. His own name, his mother, his purpose. Before they left, Maul dispatched the snake-like creature that had been exploiting him for years. One small, focused act of clarity breaking through a mind shattered for over a decade. Back on their homeworld, Mother Talzin restored her son's mind and fashioned him a proper new pair of cybernetic legs from destroyed battle droid parts, finally giving him a functional humanoid form again after more than 10 years. Once restored, Maul explained his history to his brother and swore an oath of vengeance against the Jedi who had defeated him, and the two of them set out on a campaign specifically designed to draw that Jedi back out into the open. Maul chose not to rejoin the Sith Order under his old master. Instead, he set out to build his own rival criminal empire from scratch. By the height of the Clone Wars, this rogue Sith Lord had managed to convince some of the most powerful crime syndicates in the galaxy to work together under one banner, an alliance called the Shadow Collective, and it would last for barely a year before everything came crashing down. Maul's underlying goal was twofold: threaten his old master's plans through a competing power base, and simultaneously compete with him for actual political control of the galaxy, hoping to build a unified criminal state that could take down both the Republic and the Separatists at once. He recruited 5 major underworld forces to build this coalition, each brought in through a different approach entirely suited to their specific weaknesses. Death Watch, the Mandalorian splinter faction we covered earlier, joined because their new leader wanted to retake Mandalore itself, and Maul wanted a base of operations, a perfect alignment of interests. Black Sun was simply attacked outright, its leadership decimated in a single brutal strike, forcing the survivors to swear allegiance under threat of further losses. The Pike Syndicate joined willingly once its leaders saw the scale of army Maul was assembling. The Hutt cartel proved far more difficult, initially refusing outright until Maul's brother tracked down where the Hutt leadership was actually hiding and forced the issue through more direct means. And finally, Maul's own Night Brothers joined naturally through his mother's involvement. The Coalition's first major move was the takeover of Mandalore itself, executed through a brilliant piece of misdirection. Maul had his criminal allies strike the Mandalorian capital first, terrifying the local population, and then had Death Watch arrive as the supposed heroic rescuers, dethroning the pacifist government in the aftermath and installing themselves as the new leadership, all while the public had no idea the entire invasion had been orchestrated by their own rescuers from the start. Shortly after his own rise to power, though, the new Death Watch leader turned on Maul completely, having gotten what he personally wanted and having no intention of fighting anyone else's larger war. Maul was captured, displayed publicly as a defeated criminal and imprisoned, but he and his brother escaped, and Maul issued a direct challenge for single combat with the title of Mandalore itself on the line. He won, claiming both an ancient and deeply sacred Mandalorian weapon and the title of Mandalore in a single stroke, immediately splitting the Death Watch loyalists into 2 factions, and installing a puppet prime minister to maintain the appearance of neutrality while he ruled from behind the throne. But that coup attracted exactly the attention Maul had been hoping to avoid. His old Sith master arrived personally, viewing his former apprentice as a genuine rival who needed to be eliminated entirely. In the resulting confrontation, Maul's brother was permanently finished, and Maul himself was overwhelmed with Force lightning and taken prisoner, tortured for information about his criminal network before eventually escaping with help from his own puppet government back on Mandalore. The Shadow Collective collapsed almost as quickly as it had assembled. The Hutts withdrew first, followed by the Pikes and Black Sun once their own operations were crushed by Separatist forces, sent specifically to dismantle what Maul had built. He ultimately lost Mandalore entirely when the Republic laid siege to the planet at the very end of the Clone Wars, with a young former Jedi Padawan personally defeating him in single combat during that final operation. One specific piece of the Shadow Collective's framework, though, would not stay quiet forever. It would rise again in a new form during the early Imperial era, under a name that would become known as Crimson Dawn, carrying pieces of Maul's Underworld coalition deep into the years still to come. After the Shadow Collective fell apart, Maul didn't abandon his ambitions for the Underworld. He took the strongest surviving piece of that broken coalition and quietly rebuilt it into something new, an operation that would eventually be turned against the Sith Order itself. That new operation was Crimson Dawn, which emerged during the early years of the Galactic Empire and would eventually be counted among the 5 great syndicates of the Imperial era. But the most interesting thing about Crimson Dawn was a structural secret most outsiders never learned. For nearly its entire existence, the person publicly running the syndicate was never the one actually in charge. Crimson Dawn began as a group of mercenaries with a genuinely brutal reputation, joining Maul's Shadow Collective late in the Clone Wars. One of the very last groups to formally align with him before the larger coalition collapsed entirely. When everything else fell apart under his old master's pressure, Crimson Dawn was the one piece Maul managed to keep quietly intact behind the scenes. Once the Empire rose to power, he retained covert leadership from his own homeworld, running the entire syndicate through a public-facing lieutenant, a violent, charismatic crime lord who operated from a luxurious private yacht and appeared to the outside world to be running his own independent empire. He never was. He was reporting back to Maul the entire time. That hidden arrangement lasted until a young woman from Corellia changed everything. She'd grown up in one of that world's roughest neighborhoods, escaped into a local gang, and eventually ended up sold into Crimson Dawn's service, where the public-facing lieutenant personally trained her in both combat and underworld politics. She rose rapidly through the ranks, eventually becoming his most trusted lieutenant, without any idea that Maul was secretly the one actually running things. Years later, a coaxium fuel heist gone sideways brought her into direct conflict with her own mentor, and in the resulting confrontation, she turned on him completely, ending him with his own ceremonial blade and stepping directly into his position. Using his signet ring to make contact with the syndicate's real, secret boss for the very first time, she learned the truth. Maul had been running everything all along, and he revealed to her, in turn, one of the biggest secrets in galactic politics. That the sitting emperor and his own enforcer were both secretly Sith lords, and that the entire empire functioned as a puppet government through which the Sith had quietly retaken control of the galaxy after thousands of years operating from the shadows. That knowledge changed her ambitions permanently. She was no longer interested in simply running a profitable crime syndicate. She intended to weaponize the entire organization against the Sith themselves. Maul's own end eventually came on a desert world, falling at last to the very Jedi who had first defeated him decades earlier, closing the loop on a revenge cycle that had consumed both their lives. With Maul gone, his former proc formally took over Crimson Dawn, rebuilding it around a single ultimate purpose, bringing down the Emperor and his enforcer simultaneously, using the Syndicate's reach and chaos as a weapon against the Sith and the Empire at once. She expanded her web of agents throughout every major power in the galaxy, embedding operatives inside the Empire, inside the growing rebellion, and inside every rival underworld faction simultaneously. Years later, Crimson Dawn announced its dramatic return to the galactic stage through a public auction of a carbonite-frozen smuggler stolen from another famous bounty hunter, using the event to deliberately manufacture a rift between the Empire and the Hutt cartel by manipulating both sides into competing for the same prize. Crimson Dawn's resurgence carried Maul's underworld legacy forward long after his own death, having survived the fall of two separate leaders in succession and pushed further from its brutal mercenary origins towards something the galactic underworld had never quite produced before, a syndicate built on shadows and revenge, with an end goal reaching far beyond simple profit toward the complete destruction of the Sith Order itself. There was a moment during the Galactic Civil War when only two beings in the entire galaxy held more political power than a single crime lord, and that same crime lord was already quietly plotting to outmaneuver one of them. He was Prince Xizor, a Faline noble by birth, and by the height of the war he was officially recognized as the third most powerful being in the entire galaxy, ranked below only the sitting Emperor and his enforcer. Xizor had a personal score to settle with that enforcer that ran far deeper than mere ambition. His base of operations sat on Coruscant itself, a deliberately provocative political statement in the form of a massive palace constructed near the seat of imperial power. He'd been extraordinarily wealthy even before rising to lead Black Sun, having inherited a fortune from his noble family, and he ran a legitimate transport and shipbuilding business on the side that served as a public front feeding directly into his underworld operations. Xizor had been climbing through Black Sun's hierarchy since before the Clone Wars even began, and when the war ended he moved fast, cultivating a close personal relationship with the newly proclaimed Emperor, and using those political connections to secure a leadership position within the Syndicate over a rival competitor. From there, he patiently maneuvered a weak-willed underlord out of the top position entirely over the following years, completing his takeover of Black Sun by the onset of the Galactic Civil War. That single power grab set Black Sun on a path toward the greatest prestige it would ever achieve. His second major move came through a Hutt succession crisis, when the head of a rival clan was poisoned by Jabba and left in air facing hostile challengers from within his own family. Xizor stepped in, offering to eliminate the rivals personally in exchange for a cut of the clan's spice profits, and through that single arrangement, effectively absorbed half of a major rival Hutt clan into Black Sun's orbit, while keeping his separate dealings with Jabba intact. But the defining conflict of the second half of Xizor's career was his bitter personal feud with Darth Vader. Rooted in a tragedy on his own homeworld years earlier, when Vader ordered the elimination of an entire contaminated population following a biological weapons accident, and 200,000 of Scizor's own people died in the process, including his family. Scizor held a personal vendetta against Vader from that day forward, seeking every opportunity to embarrass him in front of the Emperor, while Vader, aware of the plotting, waited patiently for the right moment to respond. The Emperor himself was not naive about any of this, using Scizor's legitimate business interests as part of his own larger schemes, including a plan to use Black Sun as an unwitting pawn to leak secret Death Star construction plans to the rebellion. Since the rebels trusted Black Sun as an independent player outside direct Imperial control,